Welcome to Ican. Comes of Age for Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 2. The Three Legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous. Service, the Third Legacy. The AA Principles of Service. As expressed in the 12 Traditions and the 12 Steps. Each AA group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting. Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional. AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. We try to carry this message to alcoholics, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Note, the traditional principles of AA service stated above have been amplified by Bill W., and made a part of the AA Service Manual and 12 Concepts for World Service. We are gathered here for the final hours of AA's 20th anniversary celebration. Above us floats a banner on which is inscribed the new symbol for AA, a circle enclosing a triangle. The circle stands for the whole world of AA, and the triangle stands for AA's Three Legacies of Recovery, Unity, and Service. Within our wonderful new world, we have found freedom from our fatal obsession. That we have chosen this particular symbol is perhaps no accident. The priests and seers of antiquity regarded the circle enclosing the triangle as a means of warding off spirits of evil, and AA's circle and triangle of recovery, unity, and service has certainly meant all of that to us and much more. On our first evening together here in St. Louis, we looked at the base of our triangle, AA's first legacy of recovery, on which everything rests and depends. During our second evening we contemplated unity, AA's second legacy, and all its vast meaning for our future. Now we want to think about the third side of our triangle, AA's third legacy of service, which in this afternoon's closing hour will be delivered into your hands for all time to come. Then our symbol will be complete, and may recovery, unity, and service, the means by which, under God, our fellowship has been created, be ever at His command for so long as He may use this society. AA's 12th step, carrying the message, is the basic service that our fellowship gives. It is our principal aim and the main reason for our existence. AA is more than a set of principles, it is a society of recovered alcoholics in action. We must carry AA's message, otherwise we ourselves may fall into decay and those who have not yet been given the truth may die. This is why we so often say that action is the magic word. Action to carry AA's message is therefore the heart of our third legacy of service. Yet some of us are still a bit confused about AA's third legacy. We still ask, just what is this third legacy business anyhow? And just how much territory does service action take in? The answer is simple. An AA service is anything whatever that legitimately helps us to reach fellow sufferers. As we have seen, the 12th step call is the greatest of AA's services. But the publicity that caused the prospect to get in touch with us, the car we rode in, the gasoline we paid for, and the cups of coffee we bought him, all of these aids were necessary to make our call possible and effective. And this is only the start. Our services involve meeting places, hospital cooperation, intergroup offices, and pamphlets and books. Services can require committees, delegates, trustees, and conferences. They include small voluntary money contributions so that the group, the area, and AA as a whole can function. They range all the way from the cup of coffee up to AA's General Service Headquarters for national and international action. The sum of all these services is AA's third legacy. Such services are utterly necessary to AA's existence and growth. Yearning for simplicity, we often wonder if we could not do away with many of AA's present services. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have no bother, no politics, no expense, and no responsibility? But this is only a dream about simplicity, it would not be simplicity in fact. Without its essential services, AA would soon become a formless, confused, and irresponsible anarchy. Regarding any particular service, we need to ask only one question: is this or that service really needed? If it is not, then let it be eliminated. But if it is needed, then maintain it we must or fail in our mission to those who want and seek AA. For 20 years now we AAs have been trying to determine what are needed services and what are not. As I tell the story of the growth of AA services, I hope that the vision of our third legacy will come clear. Let's begin with my own sponsor, Ebby. When Ebby heard how serious my drinking was, he resolved to visit me. He was in New York, I was in Brooklyn. His resolve was not enough, he had to take action and spend money. He called me on the phone and then got into a subway, total cost, 10 cents. At the level of the telephone booth and subway turnstile, spirituality and money began to mix. One without the other would have amounted to nothing at all. Right then and there, Ebby established the principle that AA in action calls for the sacrifice of much time and a little money. Now let us have a look at one of those little meetings we held during that first summer in Akron. We gathered in Dr. Bob's living room and made her home ready for us, so we had shelter over our heads. There was some expense for coffee, and Dr. Bob paid it. If and Dr. Bob had not given these hospitable services, no meeting could have been held. As the Akron meeting got larger, it moved over to the house of T. Henry and Clarice Williams. They purchased a lot of extra chairs, served many suppers, and stood for much wear and tear on their house too. We alcoholics did not pay a cent. T. Henry and Clarice sacrificed a great amount of time and some money. If they had not done so, there could not have been any meeting. In these obvious examples I think we can see what the test of an AA service really is. Whether it is a book, a translation, a service conference, or a 20th anniversary convention, the principle is the same, the test is identical. Do we need this particular service or do we not? That is the only question. As AA grew, homes were no longer big enough for meetings. We had to move into hotel parlors and halls. This marked the time when the groups themselves had to begin to pay. Landlords wanted their money, so a collection had to be taken. These collections were voluntary, but great cries went up nevertheless. AA was not supposed to cost anything, it was said. We cannot mix this great spiritual idea with landlords' commercialism. But the landlords were not impressed. We had to pay or get out. So we did pay, and voluntary contributions became a fact of AA life. We could not function without them. Moreover, somebody had to collect the money and bank it and account for it. This meant the existence of a treasurer. The group soon found, too, that it needed a secretary and sometimes a chairman. Absolutely necessary arrangements had to be made and people had to be appointed or elected to do the jobs. This often brought friction and power driving, but it was found that the group had to survive and function, no matter what the cost. Means had to be found to keep friction makers and power drivers down to their right size. A suitable service committee, considerable mild coercion, coupled with much love and understanding, proved to be the answer. So these sometimes frightening experiences were not bad for us after all. They helped everybody to grow. Meanwhile the group went on functioning because it had to function or fail in its mission. Cities and areas had their own special service problems. Unable to reach AA on the phone, alcoholics and their families got discouraged as they tried to contact us. This caused needless suffering and sometimes loss of life. Hospitals also became tired of slapdash, irresponsible admittance of patients into their institutions. This condition was not simplicity at all, it was complication. Sponsorship into these places and out of them became imperative, otherwise the hospitals might get fed up and quit. Ignoring the cries of, "Let us keep it simple," and goaded by the sheer necessity of the situation, responsible old-timers in such areas would often hire a small office and a paid secretary, and would then act as a management committee for the service center. Next, the old-timers would ask the surrounding groups for voluntary contributions. When these failed to meet the needs of the simple and inexpensive setup, they often went into their own pockets. If the newly hired secretary happened to be an AA member, this was a surefire cause for trouble. The often frightened little gal soon learned that she was considered a professional AA, making money out of it. Of course this was unfounded because primarily she was doing a secretarial job. Over the years the areas learned the same lessons the groups did. They found what was necessary to make an AA area function, and what was not. Out of this long travail and struggle, AA's present intergroup or area central offices have emerged. In scores of cities they are doing a vitally necessary job. Meanwhile we found that we needed services that we could not perform ourselves. Chief among these was the right kind of hospitalization. Doctoring and physically caring for the very sick was not and could not be AA's business. Here great friends like Dr. Silkworth and Sister Ignatia came to our aid. An ever-growing number of hospitals has since welcomed us into the closest cooperation. Among these pioneers was Charles B. Towns Hospital in New York, St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, St. Vincent Charity Hospital in Cleveland, and Knickerbocker Hospital in New York. These and many others are superb examples of what our friends outside of AA have done to help us better to function and to serve. In addition to these hospitals, we find today an impressive list of drying out places, farms, state and provincial clinics, and many kinds of civic and professional people and groups, all interested in the solution of the problem of alcoholism. Jurists, penologists, educational committees, psychiatrists, great industrial enterprises all are helping. What these outside services have meant in terms of aid to AA and endorsement of our society is beyond estimate. The world of religion likewise has come to our aid. We enjoy the blessings of practically all sects and denominations. Any number of us as individuals have been counseled and brought into greater spiritual understanding and growth by the help of devoted clergymen. Without all this outside help AA might never have started in the first place or grown so well since. These were, and still are, indispensable services. Another great service has been performed by AA's friends of press, radio, and all kinds of communications. These agencies have given AA millions of dollars of free publicity. They have brought alcoholics to us by the tens of thousands. And they never have required anything of us except our cooperation in getting the story of AA before the world. We know that without the help of these friends our growth would have been slow indeed. Now we come to the story of AA's world services. Because these activities are so remote from most of us, not many know how AA's overall service structure was built or what it has accomplished. To those who do know the real story, this is one of the most vital and exciting developments in all our history. When Dr. Bob and I realized on that fall day in 1937 that some 20 of us had recovered from alcoholism, we at once asked ourselves, how can this experience be shared? How can the word be spread? Dr. Bob had recovered 2.5 years before, and I had been sober 3 years. It had taken all this time to perfect the recovery program and to bring sobriety to a handful of sufferers. The number of alcoholics in the world who wanted to get well was reckoned in millions. How could the great chance we had had be brought to them? At the snail's pace we had been going, it was clear that most of them could never be reached. We could therefore no longer be a seldom heard of secret society. Word-of-mouth communication with the few alcoholics we could contact by our then current methods would be not only slow but dangerous because the recovery message in which we now had such high confidence might soon be garbled and twisted beyond recognition. Clearly our budding society and its message would have to be publicized. Hardly a fraction of the world's alcoholics could be expected to come to Akron or New York for treatment. Somehow we would have to reach them where they were. Maybe we would have to get some of our members subsidized as missionaries to do this. It was already plain that most hospitals did not want to be bothered with alcoholics. Their beds were filled with people who seemed better subjects for treatment. Perhaps we would need to operate a chain of hospitals, and maybe the proceeds of such a venture would pay the missionaries. Above all, we would have to put our methods down on paper. A book of experience could carry our message to distant places we could never visit ourselves. Moreover, such a book could prevent the otherwise inevitable garble and distortion that would start as soon as publicity came. It would not only guide alcoholics to recovery, but also become the basis for telling our story to the world and therefore a guide to our public relations as well. These were our reflections and speculations. Dr. Bob very much liked the idea of a book, but when it came to paid missionaries and profit-making hospitals he was frankly dubious. Promoter that I was, I shared few of his fears. I felt that we would have to have money and maybe a lot of it. Neither of us could give the work our full attention unless we were subsidized. And our members could not be expected to throw over their jobs and ignore their families' needs in order to do free missionary work. If we had our own hospitals, we would have to be financed. The book alone would take considerable time and some money. Neither Dr. Bob nor I had money, we had only debts. Every other member was in much the same fix. We would simply have to solicit money or get nowhere. Only half convinced, Dr. Bob rightly wondered what all these complications might do to the spirit of our undertaking, the carrying of our message to fellow alcoholics with no strings and no money attached. Finally he said, "Why don't we call the Akron boys together and have a meeting at T. Henry's? Let's try these ideas out on them." At T. Henry's house, 18 of the Akron alcoholics listened stolidly to our proposals. I kept pouring on my arguments for missionaries, hospitals, and the book as thick as I could. Despite his doubts, Dr. Bob strongly backed me up, especially about the need for a book. The moment we were through, those alcoholics really did work us over. They rejected the idea of missionaries. Paid workers, they said, would kill our goodwill with alcoholics. This would be sheer ruin. If we went into the hospital business, everybody would say it was a racket. Many thought we must shun publicity, we would be swamped, we could not handle the traffic. Some turned thumbs down on pamphlets and books. After all, they said, the apostles themselves did not need any printed matter. Dr. Bob and I returned to the fray and renewed our pressure, but this settled nothing and a vote had to be taken. By the barest majority, and over the most strenuous objections, the Akron meeting finally decided that we ought to go for the whole works: the missionaries, the hospitals, and the book. Even then, no one present volunteered to do much about these things. If a lot of money was needed, I had better go back to New York where there was plenty and raise it myself. Such was the verdict of that meeting, and a mighty close shave it was. In later years, I came to be very thankful for that powerful minority. Their contention that going into big business and hiring paid missionaries would destroy us turned out to be absolutely correct. On the other hand, had the ultra-conservatives prevailed, and had we done nothing, AA might have got nowhere after all. Though I did not see it then, the group conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous was already at work hammering out right decisions for AA's future. The majority of the meeting had given me permission to do as I wanted, and it was quite easy for the time being to ignore the minority warnings. But that was not the end of the minority, as we shall presently see. Much elated, I grabbed a train for home. I figured that the new developments would take millions of dollars. Our little New York group gave me more encouragement than had the Akronites. Most of them soon fell in with my grandiose notions. It was felt that raising money for such a noble enterprise should present no difficulties at all. We said to each other, "Why, this is probably one of the greatest medical and spiritual developments of all time. Certainly the rich will help us. How could they do anything else?" Then, too, the New York group had already scraped up a couple of super salesmen, people who thought exactly as I did. So AA's first and last great crusade for money got off to a flying start. Armed with a list of wealthy prospects, we commenced to solicit funds. To our astonishment we got absolutely nowhere. Some of the wealthy exhibited mild concern and sympathy, but they were not really interested. Almost unanimously they seemed to think that tuberculosis, cancer, and the Red Cross were better charity investments. Why should they try to revive a lot of down-and-out alcoholics who had brought their troubles upon themselves? In great dejection we finally saw that drunks as objects of large charity might never be a popular cause. I was quite angry and depressed, and in this mood I visited the office of my brother-in-law, Dr. Leonard V. Strong, Jr., to whom I delivered a diatribe on the stinginess and short-sightedness of the rich. Ours was a movement that would doubtless sweep the world. What was the matter with people anyway? Leonard had heard all this before, and somewhat wearily he said, "Years ago, I knew a man called Willard Richardson. As I remember, he had something to do with John D. Rockefeller's charities. I think he used to be very close to the Rockefeller family. If he is still alive, I believe he would remember me. Maybe he is still at the Rockefeller offices. I'll call up and find out." Leonard called, and at once the voice of one of our greatest friends-to-be, Mr. Willard Richardson, came over the wire. He said, "Why, hello, Leonard, where have you been all of these years? I'd love to see you." My brother-in-law replied, "I have with me a relative who has had some success in straightening out alcoholics. Could we come and talk to you about it?" Mr. Richardson said, "Of course you can. How about tomorrow?" The next morning Leonard and I alighted on the 56th floor of the RCA building where Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., had his offices. Soon we were shaking hands with Mr. Richardson, an elderly gentleman who had twinkling eyes set in one of the finest faces I have ever seen. He was warmly cordial. He showed the deepest interest as I unfolded the story of our struggling fellowship. After he had heard me out, that wonderful gentleman said, "I think we should have another meeting soon. Maybe you and I ought to have lunch together. What about next week?" In the elevator lobby my brother-in-law ran into a commuter friend, who said, "So you have been in to see Mr. Richardson? If you happen to want anything from Mr. Rockefeller personally, he is certainly your man. He has been in charge of Mr. Rockefeller's private charities for years." This was terrific. Here was the inside track. Here was a patron at last. Our money troubles were over. As promoters, we were doing all right after all. At lunch with Mr. Richardson the following week my expectations were confirmed. He was keenly interested in the story of our society and its needs. He proposed still another meeting, to be held in Mr. Rockefeller's private board room. He would bring with him Mr. Albert Scott, chairman of the trustees for Riverside Church, Mr. Frank Amos, an advertising man and close friend, and Mr. A. Leroy Chipman, an associate who looked after some of Mr. Rockefeller's personal affairs. And, of course, there would be Dr. Strong, who had brought us together. I was to bring Dr. Silkworth and some of the New York alcoholics, along with Dr. Bob and certain members from Akron. I rushed home to Brooklyn and excitedly called Dr. Bob. We were riding high on pink cloud number 17. The historic evening in December, 1937, finally arrived. We had supper and presently found ourselves in Mr. Rockefeller Jr.'s private board room. My chair at the great table felt warm, and it was explained that Mr. Rockefeller himself had just vacated it. This made the chair feel even warmer. We were certainly getting close now. There was a rather awkward pause while our friends waited for us to say something. I guess we were a bit awestruck. Then someone suggested that each alcoholic present tell his own story, just as he would at a meeting. As we told our several tales of alcoholic misery and release, we could see that a very deep impression was being made. When we were through, Mr. Scott, who chaired the meeting at the head of the table, exclaimed, "Why, this is first-century Christianity." And then, still more to the point, he added, "What can we do to help?" Our big moment had come. I mentioned our need for money, for paid workers, chains of hospitals, and literature. Though we could of course start modestly, these things eventually might require large sums. The need, I ventured, was very urgent. Though the risks of such undertakings might be considerable, the risk of doing nothing whatever would certainly be greater. Dr. Silkworth and the rest of our contingent at the table expressed the same opinion. Then Mr. Scott posed a question that is still heard in AA to this day. "Won't money spoil this thing?" he asked. The discussion became general, and we were bombarded with questions. Won't money create a professional class? Wouldn't professional members spoil the man-to-man approach that is now successful? Wouldn't the management of a hospital chain, with all the property and money required, be a fatal diversion? This barrage of questions was disconcerting. Though they were calm about it, these men sounded for all the world like the vociferous minority out there in Akron. We all realized that, coming from such unbiased friends, these were good questions indeed. We answered that we had already pondered these perils ourselves but had finally concluded that to do nothing at all would be even more perilous. Being deeply convinced that this was true, we earnestly continued to press our case with the same arguments that had been used in Akron. At last, impressed with this logic, our new friends began to yield. They admitted that we did need money, at least some money. At this point, Mr. Amos, who was to become a great friend and a long-time trustee for AA, promised to make an investigation of our society which might be the basis for asking Mr. Rockefeller for some funds. Mr. Amos had never laid eyes on us before, and we were deeply moved by this evidence of his interest and generosity. We suggested that Mr. Amos first look at the Akron group. Akron was our first group and our largest. It worked in a more typical community than New York. If an AA hospital were to be put into operation, the Akron location would be better, and Dr. Bob would be available to superintend it. For fear of embarrassing Dr. Bob, there was another reason we did not mention. Though more than 2 years sober, he had been unable to revive his surgical practice. People were glad for his sobriety, but they still feared the knife in his hands. Each was asking, "What if he gets drunk the morning he cuts me up?" We knew Dr. Bob was facing a mortgage foreclosure on his home, and if any money was forthcoming, he needed it more than any of the rest of us. A week later Frank Amos arrived in Akron and ran a fine-tooth comb through the situation there. He questioned local citizens and certain medical associates of Dr. Bob's. He went to several meetings and talked with each alcoholic member. He also looked at a large vacant residence which might be converted into a hospital where Dr. Bob could work. Frank caught the contagion, and he came back to New York red-hot. At the conclusion of his enthusiastic report he recommended that Mr. Rockefeller grant us $50,000 just as a starter. With this money 2 or 3 of us could be subsidized, a down payment on the hospital could be made, and Dr. Bob could be relieved of his mortgage troubles. Mr. Richardson quickly took the glowing report to his friend, Mr. Rockefeller, who we thought would surely be interested. Here was medicine, here was religion, and here was a great good work, all in one package. Dick Richardson read Frank's report and then added his own account of what he had seen and heard from us. Mr. Rockefeller listened intently. He was tremendously impressed and said so. He has continued to say so ever since and has repeatedly stated that his connection with Alcoholics Anonymous is numbered among the finest and most moving experiences of his life. Nevertheless, Mr. Rockefeller flatly turned down this plea for a large sum, despite the fact that our project appealed to his every charitable inclination. After a rereading of Frank's report, he said to his old friend, "Dick, I am afraid that money will spoil this thing." When he gave his reasons, they were identical with those advanced by the Akron group's minority. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., was guided then and there to save the AA fellowship from itself and from unnecessary hazards of money, property, and professionalism. It was one of the turning points in AA's history. His great wealth could have ruined us. At this juncture, Dick Richardson described the desperate financial plight of Dr. Bob and myself. On hearing of this, Mr. Rockefeller said, "I will place $5,000 for their use in the treasury of the Riverside Church. You may draw on this as you like. This will give these men some temporary assistance. But this fellowship should soon become self-supporting. If you and the others do not happen to agree, if you really think that the movement needs money, of course you can help them to raise it. But please don't ever ask me for any more." This was very great news for Alcoholics Anonymous, but at the time it seemed like bad news. It was in fact a shattering blow to our hopes. Nevertheless, Dr. Bob and I were grateful to get off the hook, even for a little while. The small mortgage on Dr. Bob's place was paid off, and each of us began to receive $30 a week for as long as the money might last. Otherwise, we stood just where we had been all along. The prospect of missionaries and hospitals and the book had gone dim. Uncle Dick Richardson was definitely disappointed, and so were friends Amos, Chipman, and Strong. Seeing that they were not in complete agreement with Mr. Rockefeller, we renewed our pleas for aid. Maybe they would know other men of wealth who might be solicited with more success. To our delight, all four thought this possible, and we held frequent meetings to talk about it. By the spring of 1938 a definite program of action took shape. It was agreed that we needed a tax-free charitable trust or foundation. Wealthy contributors could then deduct gifts from their tax returns. Such a foundation would be a responsible repository for these funds and would guarantee the wise use of all contributions. Messrs. Richardson, Amos, and Chipman agreed to serve as trustees, and so did my brother-in-law, Dr. Strong. These were the first steps in forming the Alcoholic Foundation, recently renamed the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. Frank Amos next secured the valuable help of a young friend, John Wood, then a rising junior in one of New York's famous law offices. This gave us the best possible legal talent. John Wood sat in at our meetings, and we commenced our work. The first move was to choose a name for the new outfit. After long discussion we decided to call it the Alcoholic Foundation. This seemed like a resounding tide, one that could create an impression of large importance. Still swayed by big ideas, we thought our trusteeship ought to be chartered to do just about anything within the field of alcohol or alcoholism except lobby for prohibition. We intended an arrangement by which we could research, educate, and do a lot of other things. Attention to our membership would be only one of many functions. Thus the Alcoholic Foundation got its name and its charter. Then we ran up against a legal riddle. It was thought that the Board of Trustees should consist of alcoholics and non-alcoholics. The latter were always to be in the majority by a margin of 1. This would assure our membership and other contributors that non-alcoholics would be holding the purse strings. Mr. Wood then blandly asked us to define an alcoholic, and then a non-alcoholic. We came up with the definition that the alcoholic was a sick person who couldn't drink at all. The non-alcoholic, we surmised, was a perfectly well man who could drink if he wanted to. This made no legal sense at all, and Mr. Wood, still puzzled, finally gave up the attempt to describe an alcoholic in legal terms. But he soon found a way out of the impasse by suggesting that we write up a simple trust agreement and sign it. This would avoid the whole business of a formalized charter. Soon afterward this document was completed, and the Alcoholic Foundation was in business. Our first board consisted of 5 trustees. Dick Richardson, Frank Amos, and Dr. Strong were the non-alcoholic members, and we chose Dr. Bob and one of the New York AAs as the alcoholic contingent. Anxious to encourage us, our friends insisted on monthly trustee meetings. For a while nothing happened at them except commiseration for the fact of the foundation's empty treasury. But at one of these meetings in the early fall of 1938, Frank Amos popped up with an idea which opened the door upon our real future. Frank said, "One of my friends, Eugene Exman, is religious editor of Harper. Perhaps he would be interested in your new book. Why don't you go down there and show him the few chapters you have done? I'll fix it up for you." So down I went to meet Gene Exman, another wonderful friend-to-be of our society. I related the tale of our struggles and handed over to him my first attempt at authorship. While I waited, Gene thoughtfully scanned the 2 chapters. Then he asked, "Could you do a whole book in this style? And how many months would it take you?" I was shaking, but I had an answer ready: "I believe I can do it. It will probably take 9 or 10 months. Thereupon he made a proposal that was surprising. "If it would help things along," he said, "I think Harper might be willing to advance you $1,500 in royalties. This amount would be deducted from your account when the book is finished in 1939. Again in the clouds, I left Harper to break the great news to the gang. I first headed for a visit with Frank Amos, but on the way there my elation was disturbed by disquieting thoughts. Suppose our embryo book were someday to become the chief text for our fellowship. Our principal written asset would then be owned by an outside publisher, a fine and conservative one surely, but nevertheless an outsider. So I wondered if our fellowship should own its own book. Then I thought about the $1,500 of advance royalties. When the book was done, I would still owe Harper that sum, and a good many volumes would have to be sold just to get even. And suppose that when the book appeared there were to be heavy publicity, and thousands of cries for help from alcoholics and their families began to pour in. We would not have any money to cope with this quite possible situation. I kept these misgivings to myself, and it was good to see Frank's face light up as he heard the news. In any case, it was fine to know that a firearm like Harper wanted the book and that an editor of Gene's caliber believed that it was going to be good. This experience was one of the confidence builders that kept the book project going through thick and thin. At the next foundation meeting, our friends smiled happily as they heard the details of the Harper project. It was the first ray of hope we had seen in months. The trustees were unanimous in their opinion that the Harper deal was the answer. I had shared my doubts with a few New York friends about the Harper proposal, but I had said nothing about them elsewhere. Now very reluctantly I told the trustees what they were. But our non-alcoholics on the board were not impressed with my reasons. They pointed to the well-known fact that authors seldom publish their own books and get away with it. The meeting ended on a dismal note. We were a hung jury, no conclusion or verdict was reached. Soon afterward, one of the most terrific power drivers I have ever met got into the act. This was my friend Henry P., one-time Standard Oil executive and the very first alcoholic ever to stay sober even a little while in the New York group. He had been a protégé of Dr. Silkworth's and a frequent visitor at Towns Hospital. At this time he had been sober about 2 years. Henry had red hair, at least one new idea a minute, and energy beyond telling. He was not a foundation trustee, and he had no official say at all, but that mattered not a bit. He was a hard-hitting salesman, and he sold his bill of goods. He said, "Look here, Bill, why do we bother any more with those trustees and that foundation? Those folks have not raised a cent and they are not going to. Why don't we put this proposed book on a business basis and form a stock company? Let's sell shares to our own folks right here in New York. If we give them a real argument, I'll guarantee they will get up the dough." I was an ex-Wall Streeter and had already toyed with this notion myself, but Henry had much bigger ideas and he breathed confidence. Our society would organize its own publishing company and maybe we would have to forget about the foundation. I told him the trustees would never agree to our scheme, and I did not want to hurt their feelings. But Henry's skin was thicker than mine. He was implacable. He said that it simply had to be done, and I finally agreed. Still much disturbed about the whole business, I went back to Gene Exman and frankly explained to him what was about to happen. To my utter amazement, he agreed, quite contrary to his own interest, that a society like ours ought to control and publish its own literature. Moreover, he felt that very possibly we could do this with success. Though Gene's opinion did not register at all when it was transmitted to the trustees, it did give Henry and me the kind of encouragement we so much needed. Henry wasted no time but started selling the proposition to our New York members at once. He buttonholed them one by one, persuading, browbeating, hypnotizing. I trailed around in his wake, smoothing ruffled feelings and trying to dispel some of the suspicions that had been created about our motives. After a couple of weeks of this kind of violent promotion we got a lukewarm consent from our Eastern membership. Dr. Bob was dubious, but he also consented. He did think it would be unwise at this stage to lay the matter before the Akron membership. Some promotion might be justifiable in New York, but few Akronites would be able to see it, he thought. He felt, too, that we should try the idea out on the board of trustees. We surely could not ignore them. Meanwhile Henry and I were perfecting our plan. It would take a persuasive prospectus to induce alcoholics to part with their money for stock in a company that had not yet produced even one book. But the more we investigated, the better the proposition looked. We went to Edward Blackwell, the president of Cornwall Press, one of the largest printers in the United States. Here we discovered that the printing cost of an average-size book is only about 10% of its retail price. A 400-page volume could be printed for only a fraction of $1. If we were to price our new book at $3.50, as Henry and I figured it, this would be practically all net profit. There would be no bookstore commission, no paid advertising, and none of the usual losses that publishers had to take on books that did not sell. Our book of course would sell, and we could not fail to clean up. It looked too good to be true. I laid this information before the next trustees' meeting. I anticipated that the reaction would be bad, and it certainly was. To flatly disagree with these wonderful friends was the toughest possible assignment. Once more the trustees' meeting adjourned without agreement. I knew we would have to go through with the deal despite all the objections. It was depressing. But Henry was not depressed. He had been sitting up nights working on a prospectus. The main arguments were these: Harper had said the book was going to be a good one, and even if we paid our groups and outside bookstores $1 a book for distribution, there would still be a whopping profit margin. The book could be printed at very low cost and sold for $2.50 wholesale or $3.50 by mail order. And when the reviews and other publicity got rolling, we were certain there would be sales by the carload. The prospectus suggested that a company be formed with stock of $25 par value. The New York alcoholics and their friends could buy 1/3 of these shares for cash. The other 2/3 would be distributed between Henry and me for our work. To mollify the trustees, it was decided that the author's royalty, which would ordinarily be mine, could go to the Alcoholic Foundation. To the prospectus Henry attached a chart which showed the estimated profits on sales of 100,000, 500,000, and even 1,000,000 books. I have now forgotten just what his hopes were, but they were fantastic. I was not quite so optimistic, but I did feel sure that the proceeds of the book would enable several of us to become full-time workers and to set up a general headquarters for our society. Whether this worked out or not, I was nevertheless convinced that our fellowship ought to own and control its own literature. Our enterprise still lacked 2 essentials. It was not incorporated and it did not have a name. Henry took care of these matters. Since the forthcoming volume would be only the first of many such works, he thought our publishing company should be called Works Publishing Incorporated. This was all right with me, but I protested that we had no incorporation on which to base shares and that incorporation would take money. Next day I found that Henry had bought a pad of blank stock certificates in a stationery store, and across the top of each certificate was typed this legend: Works Publishing Incorporated, par value $25. At the bottom there was a signature, Henry P., President. When I protested these irregularities, Henry said there was no time to waste, why be concerned with small details? So the great enterprise was launched. It remained to be seen if it would float. Henry knew every stratagem of the super salesman, and he got right down to work. He descended like a whirlwind on the New York alcoholics and some of their friends, suggesting that they take stock in the glittering new venture. I was no second-rater at this sort of thing myself, and I followed right along. Well, we did not sell even one of our proposed 600 shares of Works Publishing, cheap as we claimed it was. The New York alcoholics said, "You fellows have certainly got nerve. What made you think that we would buy stock in a book not yet written?" But Henry was not discouraged. He still had ideas. "Bill," he said, "you and I know this book is going to sell. And Harper thinks it will sell, but these New York drunks just do not believe it. Some take it as a joke, and the rest talk high and holy about mixing a spiritual enterprise with money and promotion. But if they really did think that the book would sell, they would buy the stock all right, and fast. So why don't we go up and see the Reader's Digest people and find out if they will print a piece about our fellowship and this book? If the Digest runs an article about us, we will sell those books by the carloads. Anybody can see that, even these tightwad drunks. So what are we waiting for? Let's go." 2 days later at Pleasantville, New York, we sat in the office of Mr. Kenneth Payne, then managing editor of the Digest. We drew a glowing picture of our fellowship and its book to be. We mentioned the high interest of Mr. Rockefeller and some of his friends. Mr. Payne was interested. After a while he said, "I am almost sure the Digest would like to handle this story, though of course I'll have to check it up with the other editors. Personally I think it is just the sort of thing we are looking for. When your book is ready next spring, let me know and I think we can put a feature writer to work. This should be a great story. But of course I must check it up with the staff first." "That's understood, isn't it?" Henry and I reached for our hats and sped for New York. Now we had real ammunition. That very night we started a fresh canvas, and the former doubters began to sign up. Nearly everybody was broke at the time, so we made things easy for them. They could buy their shares on the installment plan, $5 a month for 5 months for each share. Many could afford only a single share. When the trustees were brought up to date they loyally pitched in too. Some AAs had friends who signed up for small amounts. Certain of my old Wall Street cronies tossed in a few chips. People like Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Thibaut lent a hand. Soon we had a subscription of 200 shares which amounted to $5,000, and a little actual money began to come in. However, the subscribers were not animated wholly by commercialism. After receiving just a little assurance that they might someday get their money back, they really got behind the deal. At 17 William Street, Newark, New Jersey, Henry had an office which was the headquarters for a rapidly failing business. He also had a secretary named Ruth Hawk, who was to become one of AA's real pioneers. The other assets consisted of a huge desk and some plush furniture. Each morning I traveled all the way from Brooklyn to Newark where, pacing up and down in Henry's office, I began to dictate rough drafts of the chapters of the coming book. As we seemed unable to come up with any genuine outline for the publication, I worked from a hastily drawn-up list of possible chapter headings. Week after week, Henry raced around among the stock subscribers, prodding them for their installments. In addition to this dribble of money, we were able to secure $2,500 from Mr. Charles B. Towns. Most of these funds had to be devoted to office expenses and groceries for Henry, Ruth, Lois, and myself, and we kept going on this basis until April, 1939, the publication date of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. As the chapters were slowly roughed out I read them to the New York group at its weekly meeting in our parlor at Clinton Street, and copies were sent to Dr. Bob for checking and criticism in Akron, where we had nothing but the warmest support. But in the New York meeting the chapters got a real mauling. I redictated them and Ruth retyped them over and over. In spite of the heated arguments, the New York group's criticisms did help a lot, and to some extent their enthusiasm and confidence increased. So the job went until we reached the famous Chapter 5. Up to that time I had done my own story and had drafted 3 more chapters with the titles, There is a Solution, More About Alcoholism, and We Agnostics. It was now realized that we had enough background and window dressing material, and that at this point we would have to tell how our program for recovery from alcoholism really worked. The backbone of the book would have to be fitted in right here. This problem had secretly worried the life out of me. I had never written anything before and neither had any other member of the New York group. Progress on the book had been too slow for several of the stock subscribers and they had slacked off on their contributions. The hassling over the 4 chapters already finished had really been terrific. I was exhausted. On many a day I felt like throwing the book out the window. I was in this anything but spiritual mood on the night when the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous were written. I was sore and tired clear through. I lay in bed at 182 Clinton Street with pencil in hand and with a tablet of scratch paper on my knee. I could not get my mind on the job, much less put my heart in it. But here was one of those things that had to be done. Slowly my mind came into some kind of focus. Since Ebby's visit to me in the fall of 1934 we had gradually evolved what we called the word-of-mouth program. Most of the basic ideas had come from the Oxford groups, William James, and Dr. Silkworth. Though subject to considerable variation, it all boiled down into a pretty consistent procedure which comprised 6 steps. These were approximately as follows. 1. We admitted that we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. 2. We made a moral inventory of our defects or sins. 3. we confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. 4. We made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. 5. We tried to help other alcoholics, with no thought of reward in money or prestige. 6. We prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. This was the substance of what, by the fall of 1938, we were telling newcomers. Several of the Oxford group's other ideas and attitudes had been definitely rejected, including any which could involve us in theological controversy. In important matters there was still considerable disagreement between the Eastern and the Midwestern viewpoints. Our people out there were still active Oxford group members, while we in New York had withdrawn a year before. In Akron and vicinity they still talked about the Oxford group's absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. This dose was found to be too rich for New Yorkers, and we had abandoned the expressions. But all of us, East and West, were placing increasing emphasis on Dr. Silkworth's expression describing the alcoholic's dilemma, the obsession plus the allergy. By now we knew from experience that the new prospect had to accept step 1 or get no place. This particular evening, as my mind ran over these developments, it seemed to me that the program was still not definite enough. It might be a long time before readers of the book in distant places and lands could be personally contacted. Therefore our literature would have to be as clear and comprehensive as possible. Our steps would have to be more explicit. There must not be a single loophole through which the rationalizing alcoholic could wiggle out. Maybe our 6 chunks of truth should be broken up into smaller pieces. Thus we could better get the distant reader over the barrel, and at the same time we might be able to broaden and deepen the spiritual implications of our whole presentation. So far as I can remember, this was all I had in mind when the writing began. Finally I started to write. I set out to draft more than 6 steps. How many more I did not know. I relaxed and asked for guidance. With a speed that was astonishing, considering my jangling emotions, I completed the first draft. It took perhaps half an hour. The words kept right on coming. When I reached a stopping point, I numbered the new steps. They added up to 12. Somehow this number seemed significant. Without any special rhyme or reason I connected them with the 12 apostles. Feeling greatly relieved now, I commenced to reread the draft. At this moment a couple of late callers arrived. One of them was my boon companion of those days, Howard A. With him was a newcomer, dry barely 3 months. I was greatly pleased with what I had written, and I read them the new version of the program, now the 12 steps. Howard and his friend reacted violently. Why 12 steps, they demanded. And then, you've got too much God in these steps, you will scare people away. And, what do you mean by getting those drunks down on their knees when they ask to have all their shortcomings removed? And, who wants all their shortcomings removed, anyhow? As he saw my uneasiness, Howard added, well, some of this stuff does sound pretty good after all. But, Bill, you've got to tone it down. It's too stiff. The average alcoholic just won't buy it the way it stands. I sprang to the defense of the new creation, every single word of it. A terrific discussion developed which cooled only when Lois turned up a couple of hours later. Why don't you forget about it for a while, she said, and have a cup of coffee? This we did. Akronites like Paul and Dick S. liked the new steps very much. As the remainder of the book text developed, based on the 12 steps, they continued to report their approval. But in New York the hot debate about the 12 steps and the book's contents was doubled and redoubled. There were conservative, liberal, and radical viewpoints. Fitz M., the Episcopal minister's son from Maryland and the second man to recover at Towns Hospital, made constant journeys to New York in order to reinforce the conservative position. Fitz thought that the book ought to be Christian in the doctrinal sense of the word and that it should say so. He was in favor of using biblical terms and expressions to make this clear. Another early New York AA, Paul K., was even more emphatic about this. And, what do you mean by getting those drunks down on their knees when they ask to have all their shortcomings removed? And, who wants all their shortcomings removed, anyhow? As he saw my uneasiness, Howard added, well, some of this stuff does sound pretty good after all. But, Bill, you've got to tone it down. It's too stiff. The average alcoholic just won't buy it the way it stands. I sprang to the defense of the new creation, every single word of it. A terrific discussion developed which cooled only when Lois turned up a couple of hours later. Why don't you forget about it for a while, she said, and have a cup of coffee? This we did. Akronites like Paul and Dick S. liked the new steps very much. As the remainder of the book text developed, based on the 12 steps, they continued to report their approval. But in New York the hot debate about the 12 steps and the book's contents was doubled and redoubled. There were conservative, liberal, and radical viewpoints. Fitz M., the Episcopal minister's son from Maryland and the second man to recover at Towns Hospital, made constant journeys to New York in order to reinforce the conservative position. Fitz thought that the book ought to be Christian in the doctrinal sense of the word and that it should say so. He was in favor of using biblical terms and expressions to make this clear. Another early New York AA, Paul K., was even more emphatic about this. The liberals were the largest contingent and they had no objection to the use of the word God throughout the book, but they were dead set against any other theological proposition. They would have nothing to do with doctrinal issues. Spirituality, yes. But religion, no, positively no. Most of our members, they pointed out, believed in some sort of deity. But when it came to theology we could not possibly agree among ourselves, so how could we write a book that contained any such matter? There was no such thing as group opinion in these areas and there never could be. Alcoholics who had tried the missions were forever complaining about this very thing. The alcoholics' unreasoning rebellion against the specifically religious approach had severely handicapped the missions. The liberals said they did not intend to be critical, they only wanted us to remember the hard facts. These contentions could not be denied. It was true that we could not agree on a religious basis for our fellowship and that the straight religious approach had worked in relatively few cases. Thus the spiritual pitch and tone of our book was greatly influenced by the liberals. But the atheists and agnostics, our radical left wing, were still to make a tremendously important contribution. Led by my friend Henry and obstinately backed by Jim B., a recently arrived salesman, this contingent proceeded to have its innings. At first they wanted the word God deleted from the book entirely. Henry had come to believe in some sort of universal power, but Jimmy still flabbergasted us by denouncing God at our meetings. Some members had been so angered that they wanted to throw him out of the group. But most of us thought it better to let him talk on, believing that eventually he would change his mind, which he later did. What Henry, Jimmy, and company wanted was a psychological book which would lure the alcoholic in. Once in, the prospect could take God or leave him alone as he wished. To the rest of us this was a shocking proposal, but happily we listened and eventually learned something of great value. Actually our group conscience was at work to construct the most acceptable and effective book possible. Every voice in it was playing its appointed part to create an outcome that was to be nothing less than providential. As the one who had to do the writing, I was caught squarely in the middle of all this arguing. The liberals were the larger group, but they barely outnumbered the combined conservatives and radicals. For a while it looked as if we would bog down into permanent disagreement. Despairing of satisfying everyone, I finally asked that I might be the final judge of what the book said. Seeing that we would get nowhere without such a point of decision, most of the group agreed. We began to carry on again. We had not gone much farther with the text of the book when it was evident that something more was needed. There would have to be a story or case history section. We would have to produce evidence in the form of living proof, written testimonials of our membership itself. It was felt also that the story section could identify us with the distant reader in a way that the text itself might not. At this point Dr. Bob and the Akronites played a vital role. The Akron group was the larger and had more case history material, and the means of putting it into story form now appeared. 2 years earlier a former newspaperman, Jim S., had been lifted off Skid Row and nursed back to health and sobriety. Jim and Dr. Bob went after all the Akronites who had substantial sobriety records for testimonial material. In most cases Jim interviewed the prospects and wrote their stories for them. Dr. Bob wrote his own. By January the Akronites had produced 18 fine stories. 2 of them came from Clevelanders who had attended the Akron meeting, and one concerned Marie B., the wife of an Akron alcoholic, an early forerunner of today's family group development. With somewhat more difficulty the New York group produced 10 stories. At the time we were an oddly assorted crowd. Since New York had no one comparable to Akron's newsman Jim, it was thought that each New Yorker with a real record of sobriety could try to write his story himself. None of us had any writing experience, and when Henry and I tried to edit these amateur attempts there was plenty of trouble. Who were we, said the writers, to edit their stories? That was a good question, but still we did edit them. The cries of the anguished edited tale-tellers finally subsided and the story section of the book was complete in the latter part of January, 1939. So at last was the text. The end of our money supply was definitely in sight, and we were preparing to rush the book to press. But someone, I do not remember who, sounded a note of caution. These points were raised. How do we know for sure that this book will be widely acceptable to everybody? Maybe it still contains medical errors or material that might offend our friends of religion. Had we not better make a pre-publication copy of the text and some of the stories and try the book out on our own membership and on every kind and class of person that has anything to do with drunks? This method would consume still more time and money, and many objected, but at length we concluded that we had better be safe than sorry. 400 mimeograph copies of the book were made and sent to everyone we could think of who might be concerned with the problem of alcoholism. Each mimeograph was stamped, loaned copy, in order to protect our coming copyright. While we were waiting for the returns to come in, 2 hot controversies got underway. Though I had labeled the mimeograph issue, Alcoholics Anonymous, this title was still unacceptable to a great many people. The Akron and New York groups had been voting for months on possible titles. This had become an after-the-meeting form of amusement and interest. The title, Alcoholics Anonymous, had appeared very early in the discussion, probably in October, 1938. We do not know who first used these words. After we New Yorkers had left the Oxford groups in 1937 we often described ourselves as a nameless bunch of alcoholics. From this phrase it was only a step to the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous. This was its actual derivation. At the beginning I had liked this title very much. But as the book naming discussion went on, I began to have certain doubts and temptations. From the start the title, The Way Out, was popular. If we gave the book this name, then I could add my signature, by Bill W. After all, why shouldn't an author sign his book? I began to forget that this was everybody's book and that I had been mostly the umpire of the discussions that had created it. In one dark moment I even considered calling the book the B.W. Movement. I whispered these ideas to a few friends and promptly got slapped down. Then I saw the temptation for what it was, a shameless piece of egotism. So once more I began to vote for the title, Alcoholics Anonymous. We considered more than 100 titles, all told. In New York, Alcoholics Anonymous had slowly gained in favor. This trend had been helped by the appearance of our first literary light, Joe W., recently scraped out of the Bowery. Years before, he had been one of the founders of a popular and sophisticated magazine. He was all for Alcoholics Anonymous. He made a burning issue out of it and the majority of the New York group rallied around him. But we had failed to reckon with our friends in Akron. Out there a considerable majority favored calling our book, The Way Out, and the combined voting of the two groups still showed that, The Way Out, had a bare majority. Here an advantage presented itself and we seized it. I sent a wire to good old Fitz, then on his farm in Maryland. I asked him to visit the Library of Congress in Washington and find out how many books were entitled, The Way Out, and how many were called Alcoholics Anonymous. 2 days later we got this reply: the Library of Congress shows 12 books titled The Way Out. No book there is called Alcoholics Anonymous. We said to ourselves, we sure aren't going to make this book the 13th Way Out. We left the title Alcoholics Anonymous in the copy that went to the printer. That is how we got the title for our book, and that is how our society got its name. Just before the manuscript was finished, an event of great significance for our future took place. At the time it looked like just another battle over the book. The scene was Henry's office in Newark, where most of the writing had been done. Present were Fitz, Henry, our grand little secretary Ruth, and myself. We were still arguing about the 12 steps. All this time I had refused to budge on these steps. I would not change a word of the original draft, in which, you will remember, I had consistently used the word God, and in one place the expression, on our knees, was used. Praying to God on one's knees was still a big affront to Henry. He argued, he begged, he threatened. He quoted Jimmy to back him up. He was positive we would scare off alcoholics by the thousands when they read those 12 steps. Little by little both Fitz and Ruth came to see merit in his contentions. Though at first I would have none of it, we finally began to talk about the possibility of compromise. Who first suggested the actual compromise words I do not know, but they are words well known throughout the length and breadth of AA today. In step 2 we decided to describe God as a power greater than ourselves. In steps 3 and 11 we inserted the words God as we understood him. From step 7 we deleted the expression on our knees. And, as a lead-in sentence to all the steps we wrote these words: here are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery. AA's 12 steps were to be suggestions only. Such were the final concessions to those of little or no faith. This was the great contribution of our atheists and agnostics. They had widened our gateway so that all who suffer might pass through, regardless of their belief or lack of belief. By now great numbers of the 400 mimeographs which had been sent out had been returned. The total reaction was very good indeed. It was wonderful. Many helpful suggestions had been made, and 2 of these were critically important. One of them came from Dr. Howard, a well-known psychiatrist of Montclair, New Jersey. He pointed out that the text of our book was too full of the words you and must. He suggested that we substitute wherever possible such expressions as we ought or we should. His idea was to remove all forms of coercion, to put our fellowship on a we ought basis instead of a you must basis. To make this shift throughout the text of the book would be a big job. I argued weakly against it but soon gave in. It was perfectly apparent that the doctor was dead right. Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Thibaut gave us similar advice and much more besides. And we must never forget that it was Dr. Silkworth who wrote the introduction to the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous, giving the volume medical standing. All this time much needed encouragement and advice had come from Dick Richardson, Frank Amos, and Dr. Leonard Strong of our Board of Trustees. They had followed our progress with eager interest and constantly rising hope. It should here be emphasized that the creation of AA's book brought forth much more than disputes about its contents. As the volume grew, so did the conviction that we were on the right track. We saw tremendous vistas of what this book might become and might do. High expectation based on a confident faith was the steady and sustaining overtone of feeling that finally prevailed among us. Like the sound of a receding thunderstorm, the din of our earlier battles was now only a rumble. The air cleared and the sky was bright. We all felt good. In the midst of this rejoicing still another wonderful thing happened. We had worried about how the world of religion would receive our book. We were not kept waiting long. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick expressed his deepest satisfaction with the volume and promised to review it when it was released. The New York group did not contain even one Catholic member at the time the book was in preparation. A Catholic member from Akron had written his story but had volunteered no further opinion. So we were entirely in the dark as to what Catholic clergymen would say about our book. A group of laymen whose combined religious training and experience had been small indeed had produced a volume which described release from alcoholism by spiritual means. What would our Catholic friends think? We had not the slightest inkling. Then the good news came. By messenger we had sent the book Alcoholics Anonymous to the Catholic Committee on Publications in the New York Archdiocese. Our messenger was Morgan R., released only a few weeks before from Greystone Asylum and himself the first Catholic to put in an appearance in New York. It turned out he knew a member of the Church Committee on Publications. So we sent Morgan. Not long after he returned with wonderful things to tell us. The committee, he said, had nothing but the best to say of our efforts. From their point of view the book was perfectly all right as far as it went. After reading the section on meditation and prayer, the committee had made certain suggestions for improvement, though none for actual change. Morgan had brought these with him and they looked so good that we adopted them on the spot. In only one sentence of the entire book had they found it necessary to suggest a real change. At the conclusion of my own story, Chapter 1 of the original draft, I had made a rhetorical flourish to the effect that, we have found heaven right here on this good old earth. Morgan's friend on the committee pointed this out to him with a smile and said, "Don't you think that Bill W. could change that word, heaven, to utopia? After all, we Catholics are promising folks something much better later on." The committee took no official action, they just sent us word that we were all right. Indeed, this has since been the verdict of practically all denominations, a fact for which we are devoutly grateful. Mr. Blackwell wanted to know how many copies we wished. With the promised Reader's Digest article in mind, we were still thinking of carloads. Though doubtless impressed, Mr. Blackwell suggested 5,000 copies for the first printing. Then he asked what financial terms we were able to make. We cautiously let it be known that our cash was temporarily low. Pointing out what the Reader's Digest article would do for us, Henry mentioned a figure of $500 for our first down payment on the 5,000 books. Mr. Blackwell was startled and looked it. "What about that Rockefeller connection?" he asked. We replied that we had better hold that in reserve, that we were trying to manage this thing on our own if we could. Mr. Blackwell, having already caught the AA spirit, said with a twinkle in his eye, "Well, I guess that will do. I'm glad to give you a hand." So the presses were set to roll and Alcoholics Anonymous had found another wonderful friend. When making these arrangements with Mr. Blackwell we fixed the retail price of the book at $3.50. This figure was the result of long and heated arguments. Some members had insisted on a $1 book, others wanted a $2.50 printing. They had turned deaf ears to Henry's plea that we must make something on the deal or else we could never operate a headquarters office, much less pay off the shareholders. But Henry finally won through and, as a consolation to the contestants, we directed Mr. Blackwell to do the job on the thickest paper in his shop. The original volume proved to be so bulky that it became known as the Big Book. Of course the idea was to convince the alcoholic purchaser that he was indeed getting his money's worth. Very soon Henry, Ruth, Dorothy S., of Cleveland, and I wheeled up to Mr. Blackwell's big printing plant at Cornwall, New York, and checked in at the town's only hotel. We brought with us the mangled but precious printer's copy of Alcoholics Anonymous. When the Cornwall manager saw the mess our book was in he was so dismayed that he almost sent us home to make a fresh typing of the whole business. But salesman Henry prevailed upon him to try to make galleys, and day after day we corrected these as they issued from the shop. By now our money supply was gone. The hotel bill was going to be twice as much as the cash we had. To Ruth and Dorothy and me this seemed pretty awkward, but Henry stated confidently that God would provide. Henry had lately adopted the comforting theory that if God wanted something done we only had to keep running up bills which eventually he would pay. This was a heartening example of faith, but it did leave the practical question of who would be God's agent in the matter of the money. Our stockholders were already loaded for every share they could take, they had had it. Maybe good old Charlie Towns would be the man. So it fell my lot to go to New York and put the touch on him. Mr. Towns was not too favorably impressed when he heard where we stood, but he came through with the hotel bill and about $100 to spare. We took a cheerful view. Soon the book plates would be made, the presses would roll, and 5,000 books would be ready when the Reader's Digest piece broke. Henry and Ruth and I divided the last $100 among us, and we all returned to New York in high spirits. We could be patient now, prosperity was just around the corner. I will never know why, in all the time during which the book was in preparation, none of us had thought of getting in touch with the Reader's Digest. Somehow the question of timing their article with the appearance of our book had not occurred to us. As Henry and I again rode up the parkway toward Pleasantville, we wondered about this. We estimated it might take them several months to produce the promised piece. But why worry? It was just a question of time, anyhow. We were greeted by Managing Editor Payne at the door of his office. He did not remember exactly who we were. Henry gaily remarked, "Well, Mr. Managing Editor, we are all ready to shoot." And Mr. Payne, nonplussed, weakly replied, "Shoot what?" Hastily we brought him up to date, and the memory of our visit during the previous fall came back with a rush. Of course," he said. "I remember you now. You are the representatives of that fellowship of alcoholics. You wanted a digest piece about your society and the book you are preparing. You will remember that I told you I had to check this up with our editorial staff. Well, I did. To my surprise, they did not like the idea at all. They did not think there would be much interest in a society of alcoholics. And they thought besides that the whole business would be controversial, medically and religiously speaking. And worst of all, I forgot to let you people know. I am so sorry." This was shattering. Even the buoyant Henry was sunk. We protested, but it was no use. This was it. The book enterprise had collapsed. Riding home in a daze, we wondered how we could face the groups, the stockholders, the printer, and Mr. Towns. The AA Fellowship then had just about 100 members. 28 books had been promised to those who wrote stories, and 49 had to be sent free to the alcoholic stockholders and their friends who had subscribed. Soon 5,000 books would land in Cornwall's warehouse with no market whatever. Maybe the printer would have to take them over to protect himself. We had not a cent left, and certainly our $500 shoestring payment would not be much compensation to Mr. Blackwell. And what would the trustees say? Maybe they had been right after all. What would we do? How could we face up to this catastrophe? We had no ideas at all. Our homecoming, however, proved less distressing than we expected. A few of our people grumbled and said, "We told you so," but nearly everybody else took a sporting attitude and asked what had become of our faith. The trustees were mighty nice about it, too. They suggested weekly meetings to consider ways and means of getting the book into circulation. Most cheering of all, Mr. Edward Blackwell said he had no intention of turning our book over to an outside publisher. He would see us through, he said. And so he did, for many an uncertain month and year to come. It was obvious that we had to get some publicity in order to move those books. We tried magazine after magazine with no result. While we were in the midst of these efforts, Cornwall Press told us the printing was ready. It was April, 1939. Henry, absolutely broke, was trying to get work. Ruth, living at home, was given meaningless stock certificates in the defunct Works Publishing as pay. She cheerfully accepted these and never slackened her efforts. All of us were going into debt just for living expenses. Then, on May 1st, fresh calamity fell upon 182 Clinton Street. Lois and I had been living in a house which belonged to her parents before their death. The bank had taken it over and rented it to us for a nominal sum. The mortgage was so big the bank had found great difficulty in selling the place, so we had been able to stay there several years. But at this moment they found a purchaser and we had to get out. From its 4 floors the old brick house disgorged its furniture into a moving van. The warehouse had to pay the mover, since we could not. All our worldly goods were in hock with the warehouseman, and they were to stay that way for 2 years more. Where could we go? Friends rallied around. A small fund, just about the first money our foundation ever had, was set up as the Lois W. Home Replacement Fund. To this, surrounding AA families began to make tiny contributions. Small, of course, because everybody was broke. Out of this, the trustees began to pay Lois and me $50 a month. A newer member, Jack C., loaned us a battered Lincoln automobile. But where would we live? The question was settled by Howard and his mother, who owned a summer camp on a remote lake in western New Jersey. Here we stayed until snow flew in November. This interval gave us the needed opportunity to revive the bankrupt book project. Shortly after the publication of Alcoholics Anonymous in April, Dr. Fosdick had beautifully reviewed the book, just as he promised. His review was reprinted, chiefly by religious periodicals, but it had no influence so far as book orders were concerned. We were delighted when the New York Times also gave us a review. But nothing happened. We still had no book orders. Right through the summer of 1939 all attempts to get national magazines to print pieces about Alcoholics Anonymous failed. Then one day Morgan, our Irishman, came up with an idea. He said, "I used to be in the ad business and had a good deal to do with radio. I know Gabriel Heater very well, and I'm sure he would give us a hand." So off he went to see Heater and soon he was back, all smiles. "Sure thing," he said. "Gabriel is going to give us a lift." In those days Mr. Heater was on a national network with a program called We the People, consisting of 3-minute interviews. Our story appealed to him at once. He planned to interview Morgan, quickly sketching his fall and rise, and then to elicit from him some facts about AA and to put in a plug for the book. This, we thought, was simply great. And on a national hookup, too. Henry's promotional instincts were instantly revived. In connection with the broadcast he wanted to send a shower of postal cards to all physicians east of the Mississippi River. There were said to be some 20,000 of them. The card would exhort them to listen to the Heater broadcast and buy the book Alcoholics Anonymous, A Sure Cure for Alcoholism. Here was another wonderful idea, all we needed was money. Among our new prospects a couple of the more prosperous variety had just turned up. Henry went after them, brandishing his pad of Works Publishing stock certificates. They did not want any stock, but they would take promissory notes signed by the defunct publishing company and personally endorsed by Henry and me. Quite unbelievably, Henry extracted $500 from them. A list of all physicians in the eastern United States was obtained from an agency which also designed the postcard mailing. This made us feel sure of at least a few thousand book orders. Gabriel Heater meanwhile had set a date for Morgan's appearance before his microphone. It was only a week away, and we were very excited. With some of the past fiascos in mind, somebody sounded a note of caution. What if the lately released asylum inmate Morgan should be drunk the day of the broadcast? Hard experience told us this was a real possibility. How could such a calamity be averted? Very gently we suggested to a resentful Morgan that he would have to be locked up somewhere until the night of the broadcast. It took all of salesman Henry's wiles to put this one over, but he did. How and where we would lock him up was the only remaining question. Henry, with full faith now restored, solemnly declared that God would provide. He recalled that one of the prosperous newcomers had a membership in the downtown athletic club. If we paid the charges, could a double room be arranged? Grumbling loudly, Morgan was conducted into captivity. For several days we took turns staying with him right around the clock, never letting him get out of our sight. The postal card shower to the doctors was on its way and all was ready. Why had we not thought of radio before? This would be only a starter. Once more, talk was heard of book sales in carload lots. An hour before broadcast time, our whole membership and their families gathered about their radios to wait for the great moment. Sure enough, Gabriel spoke up right on the dot. Sighs of relief went up in every New York member's home when Morgan's voice was heard. He had hit the deadline without getting drunk. It was a heart-stirring 3 minutes. Gabriel Heater saw to that, and he was well assisted by Morgan, who was no slouch as a radio man. We figured that the impact on America would be terrific, especially on the doctors who had already got our 20,000 postal cards. Within 3 days we figured that Post Office Box 658 Church Street Annex, New York City, would be flooded with pleas for help and book orders. By a great effort of self-restraint we kept away for 3 whole days. Then we marched up the steps of the post office and headed straight for our box, each of us armed with a couple of suitcases to bring home some part of the first great influx. Peering through the glass, we were stunned to see less than a handful of postal cards. Henry, the optimist, rallied to exclaim, "Think nothing of it, folks. They just couldn't get them into the box. I'll bet they've got a whole mailbag full out back." The mail clerk handed us exactly 12 cards. Henry said to the clerk, "There must be a lot more. Where are they?" And the clerk replied, "This is all there is, sir." Sick clear through, we looked through the 12 replies. Some ribbed us unmercifully. Others, evidently inscribed by medics in their cups, were totally illegible. The 2 remaining cards were orders for the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Radio as a medium lost considerable stature in our eyes, and another $500 had gone down the drain. A few days later our landlord in Newark got really tough. The sheriff appeared with an eviction notice. So in a nearby office building we found a tiny room barely big enough to contain Henry's large desk, his overstuffed chair, a couple of file cases, and Ruth and her typewriter. For callers there was standing room only. Somehow we made a small down payment on the rent, wondering how many months it would be before the sheriff showed up once more. Howard Summer Camp, facing the untroubled waters of the lake, was a wonderful place to relax and recoup. Besides, we had $50 a month and a car to get around in. But what would happen when winter came? Lois began to wonder if she should not have kept her department store job. When prospects for the book had looked the brightest, I had persuaded her to quit. There was now nothing left but to press on. Somehow that book project must be revived. I confess we often reflected that after nearly 4 years of my sobriety we had no prospect of any income or the certainty of any place to live. By July Henry had found himself a job, and so the revival of the book project was left pretty much up to Ruth and me. She was still on a theoretical salary of $25 a week, but that now consisted of a weekly ration of One Works Publishing stock certificate, par $25. Not a cent of cash could we give her. It wasn't until the following October that we could pay her anything. One day in July I went into New York City, where I visited Mr. Charles Towns. As in the case of Mr. Blackwell of Cornwall Press, we owed Charlie plenty of money. But both men had cheerfully gone along. As I stepped off the elevator onto the hospital roof garden, Charlie greeted me with a broad smile. He had been raising heaven and earth to get publicity for us and had succeeded. He had known Morris Markey, a well-known feature writer, for years. Intrigued with the story of A.A., Mr. Markey had approached Fulton Ausler, then editor of Liberty magazine. That great editor, writer, and friend-to-be had instantly seen the possibilities and had commissioned Morris Markey to do a piece. "So," inquired Charlie, "when can you go to work with Morris?" To our great delight, Morris soon hammered out an article which he titled Alcoholics and God. It was to appear in the September issue of Liberty. This time we really hoped and believed that we had turned the corner, and indeed we had. But it would be October before we could get book orders as a result of the coming peace. What were we to do for money meanwhile? The rent would have to be paid and something ought to be done for Messrs. Blackwell, Towns, and certain other creditors. We simply had to find at least $1,000. One of our New York AAs, Bert T., had a fashionable tailoring shop on Fifth Avenue which he had inherited from his father. But Bert's drinking had pretty nearly demolished the business and it was still going downhill. I phoned Bert and told him what we needed. When I said that Liberty would surely print a piece in September, he said, "Are you really sure this time? After all, you and Henry were awfully sure about the Reader's Digest piece. But come on down. Maybe I can do something. Bert's clothing clients included many wealthy customers. Scanning the list, he chose one whom we shall call Mr. G. Bert said, "Now here's a man who knows all about us. He is extremely interested in the alcohol problem, though I must admit he is on the bone-dry side of the argument." When I expressed doubt about accepting help from a dry crusader, Bert Riley remarked, "Listen, Bill, this is no time to quibble. We have got to get $1,000 from anybody who will give it to us." Bert went to the phone and asked for long distance. At first, he boldly asked Mr. G for a contribution. Mr. G was uncertain. Then Bert told his customer about Works Publishing, which at the moment had a large inventory of books but little cash. The Liberty piece, however, would bring in plenty of orders. Would Mr. G care to buy some stock? Mr. G was still more dubious. Then Bert proposed that Mr. G make Works Publishing a loan. After all, the company had a large inventory of valuable books. Upon learning the true state of Works Publishing, Mr. G emphatically declined. Bert tried once more. "Mr. G," Bert said, "would you take the promissory note of Works Publishing for $1,000 if I endorsed it? As you know, I have a fine business right here on Fifth Avenue." "Most certainly," said Mr. G, "I will take such a note if you endorse it. Send it right down and I'll be delighted to send you the money." This was a real godsend, which probably saved the book company, for it kept us going until the late fall of 1939. Bert had hawked his own business, virtually bankrupt by then, to save the book Alcoholics Anonymous. This was a friend indeed. In September 1939, the Liberty piece hit the newsstands. It was a bit lurid, and we thought the title, Alcoholics and God, would scare off plenty of prospects. Maybe it did, but several hundred alcoholics and their families were not scared. Liberty magazine received 800 urgent pleas for help, which were promptly turned over to Ruth and me. She wrote fine personal letters to every one of them, enclosing a leaflet which described the AA book. The response was wonderful. Several hundred books sold at once at full retail price of $3.50. Even more importantly, we struck up a correspondence with alcoholics, their friends, and their families all over the country. Ruth could at last draw a few dollars a week for herself. And all those moving appeals for assistance had made us forget our own troubles. Looking after all those new people by mail and relating them in some cases to each other and in others to the groups in Akron, New York, and Cleveland became our chief occupation until early 1940. Shortly after the Liberty article came out, Cleveland's Plain Dealer ran its great series of pieces, as already described. This brought in new book orders and new problems by scores. Alcoholics Anonymous was on the march, out of its infancy into adolescence. As noted earlier, Lois and I moved to the home of Bob and Mag in Monsey, New York, to spend the winter of 1939 and the early spring of 1940. A little after this we moved to a friend's apartment in New York City, then briefly to a room in Greenwich Village, and finally to AA's first clubhouse, the old 24th, where we remained until the spring of 1941. The contributors to the Lois W. Home Replacement Fund kept up their good work. Thus we were comfortable enough, and our happiness grew as we watched AA unfold. One sad incident marred the early spring of 1940. Not knowing where any of us might live in the future, we had chosen Box 658 at one of New York's downtown post offices as the most central point of the whole metropolitan area, Long Island and New Jersey included. It now seemed right for us to establish a small office near this box. Backed by the book stockholders and by Ruth, I made this proposal. Henry, whose job took him into western New Jersey, objected violently. He wanted to take the book business and Ruth wherever he went. His job was not going too well, and he was on what we nowadays call a dry bender. The more we insisted, the more adamant and violent he became. He was heavily beset with other problems, too. At length he broke down completely and went on a terrific bender after 4 years of sobriety. He never again showed any real sign of recovery, and he went on drinking until his death recently. Considering what he had done for the book, and the further fact that he was one of our first New York members, this was hard to take. My own sponsor, Ebby, also continued his drinking and hadn't, as yet, shown any desire to stop. Our whole group shivered and we asked ourselves, if stalwarts like these can relapse, what is going to become of the rest of us? Actually, though, the effect was to make each one of us more vigilant. So no wave of slips followed in the wake of poor Henry's collapse. Our expansion had been immensely accelerated by the Liberty Peace and the frantic growth at Cleveland. Tiny beginnings had been made in many other towns and cities, which we denoted by placing pins in our office wall map. By early 1940 we could estimate that about 800 recoveries had been made. This number was a big jump from the figure of 100 at the time the book was published in April of the year before. The book had expressed the hope that someday AA travelers would find a group at every destination. That hope had begun to turn into reality. All through the uncertain year of 1939 our non-alcoholic friends of the Board of Trustees had stayed with us. Another New York AA member, Bill R., had been made a trustee, and Mr. A. Leroy Chipman, who had been keeping an eye on us all along, now joined up himself and became the foundation's treasurer. Nevertheless, the treasury itself was just as empty as before. In 1940 we saw the establishment of the first clubhouse and the opening of the first rest farm. The New York groupers had been complaining that weekly meetings in a rented parlor at Steinway Hall were not enough. We had to be together more. We needed something homelike, maybe a club. The idea caught on, and two of the elders, Howard and Bert, promptly spotted just the thing at 334.5 West 24th Street and personally guaranteed the rent. Tom B., another stalwart, did the same thing for the club's light, heat, and telephone. Originally the club building had been a stable in the backyards of two brick houses. It opened onto the street by a narrow covered-over alley. Years earlier the horses had given way to artists, who had paneled the place and trimmed it up nicely. The quarters had become too small for the Illustrators Club, so they moved out and we AAs moved in. The lower floor could hold a fair-sized meeting, the upper floor had a recreation room and two tiny bedrooms. One of these was soon to house old Tom, our famous first caretaker, and shortly thereafter Lois and I moved into the other one to stay for about a year. Our association there with others like Herb and Isla, Bobby and Dick, Wilbur and Ruth, Henry and Lillian, and many another will always be unforgettable. Of course the club promptly had its own peculiar troubles, just as hundreds of others have since had. But like most AA clubs this first one did us far more good than harm, especially after we learned that the club had to be on the sidelines and could not be managed by the AA groups as such. The old 24th Street Club witnessed much of AA's early history. Still in busy operation, it is now a landmark visited by members from all over the world. Similar and far larger clubs were started in Philadelphia and Minneapolis later in 1940. Scores and scores of clubrooms and clubhouses now dot our landscape. Some of the more elegant ones, especially those in Texas, have to be seen to be believed. Meanwhile up in the hills of Connecticut an interesting development had been taking place. A group of farms there belonged to a dear lady affectionately known to countless AAs as Sister Frances. This wonderfully good soul out of her own pocket had operated these farms as a series of charities, one for the aged, one for children, and one for any wayfarer who passed by. In the summer of 1939 our New York member Marty had sponsored a prospect called Nona W. Nona, one of AA's first women, had already enjoyed the farm's hospitality and eagerly conducted a party of us to Connecticut, where we met Sister Frances. That good lady had fallen on hard times, and only one farm remained. She called it the Ministry of the High Watch. Sister Frances seemed to be as delighted with us as we were with her. She offered us full use of the place if some of us would create a board of trustees to look after it. Laughingly, she has since admitted that she was shocked as well as captivated by her early alcoholic visitors. Until then, she reflected, the greatest scandal in her family had been the time when in Rome her sister was seen in the company of an Italian army officer without a chaperone. But Sister Frances made a ready adjustment to us. With each passing year we AAs have loved her more, and she has returned our affection. The Rest Farm, which has come into being as a result of Sister Frances' gift, is a charming place which, with its cabins, can accommodate more than 20 guests. It is a wonderful spot to send anyone who needs extra time to recuperate after hospitalization, and many AAs use it for vacations. Similar retreats can be found today throughout the length and breadth of our fellowship. Though they are not strictly AA enterprises, they do give many of us fine support and refreshment. On behalf of everyone I here set down our gratitude to Sister Frances and her much-altered ministry of the High Watch. At the February, 1940, meeting, Uncle Dick Richardson turned up beaming and mysterious. Presently he broke the news that Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who had not been heard from since 1937, had been following our progress with intense interest. Mr. Rockefeller had decided that he wanted to do something for Alcoholics Anonymous. He proposed a dinner meeting to which he would invite several hundred of his own friends and acquaintances, so that they might glimpse the beginnings of our remarkable fellowship. Uncle Dick produced the list of the people who were invited. It contained some 400 names, a veritable constellation of New York's prominent and wealthy. Anybody could see that their total financial worth might easily be $1 billion. To us alcoholics it appeared that Mr. Rockefeller had at last changed his mind and that our money troubles would soon be a thing of the past. At this point we were comforted to learn that Dick Richardson's fundraising friend, Mr. Carlton Sherwood, had been using his influence and good offices to bring about this promising prospect. There is a reference to Mr. Rockefeller's dinner earlier in this book, but I think that a fuller description of that memorable event ought to go into our records. For this was the moment at which AA's tradition of declining outside contributions began to take definite shape and form. On the evening of February 8, 1940, the dinner party foregathered at the Union Club in New York, a club even more conservative than the Union League itself. Some 75 of the 400 who were invited turned up. They looked like a fine lot of men, but as they gathered in the dining hall most of them did wear rather puzzled expressions. Obviously, they could not quite make out what Alcoholics Anonymous was all about. A few feared that AA was another scheme to dry up the whole world and said so. To take care of any questions, we had planted a New York AA member at each table. During dinner this thawed things out in a hurry. There were many queries, and some of our answers amazed the notables. At one table sat our hero, Morgan, as impeccably dressed as a Colorado boy. One gray-haired banker inquired, "Mr. R., what institution are you with?" Morgan grinned and replied, "Well, sir, I am not with any institution at the moment. 9 months ago, however, I was a patient in Greystone Asylum." The interest at that table took a sharp upturn. Dr. Bob had arrived with an Akron old-timer, Paul, and had also brought Clarence, a founder of the flourishing Cleveland group. Dr. Russell Blaisdell, who during the previous fall had let us work with patients in his state asylum at Rockland, New York, was there, along with our good Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Bob and I were scheduled to speak. Several other alcoholics were to handle a question-and-answer period, and the entire proceedings were to be backed up by Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, representing religion, and Dr. Foster Kennedy, the world-renowned neurologist, who would speak for medicine. We should here take special note of these two wonderful friends. Dr. Fosdick had been the very first clergyman to recognize us. Early in 1939 he had seen the pre-publication copy of the book Alcoholics Anonymous and had at once volunteered to review it. This magnificent review, shown in the appendix of this volume, well illustrates his deep understanding and high approval of our fellowship. Likewise, Dr. Kennedy, our first friend in the field of neurology, never missed an opportunity to declare his great faith in AA. Mr. Rockefeller himself had been taken ill suddenly and could not come. His son, Nelson, whom we all liked immensely, did the honors as chairman for the occasion. I was seated between Dr. Blaisdell and Nelson Rockefeller. Directly in front of me was Wendell Wilkie. The dinner was squab on toast. For a bunch of ex-drunks, we were doing remarkably well. We wondered how Mr. Rockefeller had dared to go so far out on a limb for an obscure and struggling fellowship of alcoholics. After dinner Mr. Nelson Rockefeller rose to his feet. He expressed his father's regret for being unable to attend. He told how deeply Mr. John D., Jr., had been affected by his experience with this Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. Promising a highly interesting evening, Nelson Rockefeller began to introduce the speakers. Dr. Fosdick gave us a most wonderful testimonial and expressed complete confidence in our future. Dr. Kennedy warmly endorsed us and read a letter of protest he had written to the Journal of the American Medical Association because in their review of the book Alcoholics Anonymous they had somewhat ridiculed us. Dr. Bob spoke briefly, and I gave a rapid account of my own experience as a drinker, my recovery, and the subsequent history of our fellowship. As we watched the faces of the guests, it was evident that we had captured their sympathetic interest. Great influence and great wealth were soon to be at our disposal. Weariness and worry were to be things of the past. Finally the big moment came. Mr. Nelson Rockefeller, visibly moved, got to his feet once more. On behalf of his father he thanked us all for coming. He reiterated that few more affecting things than Alcoholics Anonymous had ever crossed his father's life. His father would be delighted, Nelson said, to know how many guests had availed themselves of the chance to see the beginnings of this most promising adventure of Alcoholics Anonymous. Breathlessly we waited for the climax, the matter of money. Nelson Rockefeller obliged us. Continuing, he said, "Gentlemen, you can all see that this is a work of goodwill. Its power lies in the fact that one member carries the good message to the next, without any thought of financial income or reward. Therefore, it is our belief that Alcoholics Anonymous should be self-supporting so far as money is concerned. It needs only our goodwill." Whereupon the guests clapped lustily, and after cordial handshakes and goodbyes all around, the whole $1 billion worth of them walked out the door. We were dazed. Why had Mr. Rockefeller gone to all that trouble, just for this? We simply could not figure it out. But a few days later we began to see, and as time passes Alcoholics Anonymous sees ever more clearly what he meant and what he did. Dick Richardson had transcripts of all the talks that had been made at the dinner, and he asked me to condense and edit them. This really meant editing Dr. Bob and me, for who would edit Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick and Dr. Foster Kennedy? Dick said that Mr. Rockefeller wanted to buy 400 books, and we let him have them at a whopping discount, $1 each. He wanted to send one to every guest on the dinner list, along with a pamphlet containing the talks given at the dinner. And Mr. Rockefeller planned to write each dinner guest a personal letter, a copy of which would be presently shown us. Mr. Rockefeller's letter, which was addressed to all who came to the dinner as well as to those who did not, reiterated his high confidence in Alcoholics Anonymous, the satisfaction he had in knowing that many of his friends had witnessed the start of a movement of such great promise, and his deep conviction that our society ought to be self-supporting. He followed this with a statement to the effect that a little temporary help might be needed. He, therefore, was giving Alcoholics Anonymous $1,000. In all probability this was a mild hint that the other diners might contribute modestly if they so wished. Despite the curiosity of the press, no reporters had been allowed at the dinner. This was understandable, for Mr. Rockefeller was certainly taking chances. Had any of us alcoholics turned up stewed, the whole affair would have collapsed ignominiously. But as soon as it was seen that all had gone well, we were put in touch with the firm of Ivy Lee, Mr. Rockefeller's publicity consultants, and together we drafted a statement to the press. The ensuing publicity was favorable and widespread. The news wires carried the news of Mr. Rockefeller's dinner all over the world. A few of the stories that appeared were somewhat lurid and ran under startling headlines. One headline informed the public, "John D. Rockefeller dines tosspots." But all the stories plugged AA just the same, even the tabloids gave us the glad hand. The total effect was to give Alcoholics Anonymous a public status of dignity and worth. Thus encouraged, considerable numbers of people went to their bookstores to buy the AA book. Orders poured in and our financial difficulties were much eased. Hundreds of requests for help came from alcoholics and their families all over the nation. These names were added to our growing list of correspondents that we hoped to reach later by personal contact as our fellowship grew. The awful letdown which had followed the departure of the dinner guests was now forgotten. At about this time our trusteeship began to be enlarged. Mr. Robert Shaw, a lawyer and friend of Uncle Dick's, was elected to the board. 2 New Yorkers, my friends Howard and Bert, were also named. As time passed, these were joined by Tom B. and Dick S. Dick had been one of the original Akronites and was now living in New York. There was also Tom K., a hard-working and conservative Jersey man. Somewhat later more non-alcoholics, notably Bernard Smith and Leonard Harrison, took up their long season of service with us. The Board of Trustees conceived the idea of soliciting the dinner guests for contributions. Since Mr. Rockefeller had made a token gift of $1,000, it was supposed that the solicitation would not have any large money result. But it certainly might help. Money-wise, Dr. Bob and I were still in a rather bad way. We were therefore allotted $30 a week, and enough was on hand to keep this up for a year. Thereafter the dinner guests were solicited annually and the proceeds were always divided in the same way. For years later we were able to write Mr. Rockefeller and his friends of the Union Club dinner that we needed no more funds. By then royalties from the book were giving Dr. Bob and me the help we needed, and the AA groups had begun to pick up the load of supporting the headquarters office. At that point the AA tradition of no outside contributions went into full force and effect. Mr. Rockefeller and his friends had given us something more valuable than money. They had put AA on the map. Now to flash back for a moment to the spring of 1940. Over Henry's strong objections, we had moved from the tiny cubicle of an office in Newark to one slightly larger at 30 Vesey Street, New York City, next door to our downtown post office box. Ruth and I set about answering the mass of inquiries that came in the wake of the Rockefeller dinner and the resulting publicity. Many new AA groups took shape as travelers from the older centers, armed with lists of prospects, visited new locations. The struggles at these distant outposts were quickly reflected in letters asking for advice on the growing pains and problems of the new groups. Almost every week we happily added a new pin to our wall map to mark another group information. The sales of the AA book steadily increased, and we could now meet the cost of rent, postage, and supplies, and best of all we could pay Ruth a fair salary. Lois and I were living rent-free at the old 24th Street Club, and we were able to get along nicely on the proceeds of the Rockefeller dinner and gifts still being made to the Lois W. Home Replacement Fund in the foundation. Everybody began to breathe easier. The affairs of Works Publishing, however, were still in pretty sketchy shape. It had never been incorporated, and the only evidence of its existence were the stock certificates that Henry and I had manufactured, the books in the warehouse, and the cancelled checks that gave a rough idea of how the money had been spent. 400 shares of stock, to be equally divided between Henry and me, had never been issued and could not be issued, under our original agreement, until the cash subscribers had received all their money back. When they heard that the book was making money, some of the cash subscribers, including even Charlie Towns, began to get restless. They wanted to know why all of the profits of the book were being spent to finance a headquarters for AA. We replied that there was not any other way. Would they like to see all those pleas for help thrown in the wastebasket? But a few still insisted on getting their money back, and something had to be done. Therefore Ruth and I set about making Works Publishing's first report to its stockholders. We outlined the history of the book project and painted a rosy picture for the future. From the mass of check stubs, old bills, and receipts we made an approximate accounting. As I remember, the publishing company had shown a profit of about $3,000, which had all been spent on AA work at the office. Again we turned to our trusted pad of blank stock certificates. On a number of these we wrote, Works Publishing Incorporated, preferred stock, par value $100. Equipped with these certificates, I went off to Washington. The new AA group there included some well-to-do members, Bill E., Hardin C., and Bill A. They cheerfully bought these strange and irregular stock certificates in the amount of about $3,000. Thus we satisfied a few of the grumbling stockholders and gratefully handed to Mr. Charles Towns all of the money which he had advanced to make the book project possible. He was delighted, and so were we. In this period, one of our non-alcoholic friends performed an outstanding service for us. This was Accountant West, of West, Flint and Company, a lifelong associate of Dick Richardson. He saw that Works Publishing was properly incorporated, and he personally audited its affairs and those of the foundation from our beginnings in 1938. Ruth had had no time to keep books, and I did not know how. So a thorough CPA audit of the book company proved to be a real job. The tireless Mr. West spent days and days at it, without pay. When this difficult job of unscrambling our affairs was completed, we felt we could ask no more of Mr. West. From that point on, Wilbur S., a CPA as well as an early AA, took over the job of keeping our records in shape. He did this for a long time gratis, and even today I doubt if we pay him enough. By 1940 we had begun to see that the AA book should belong to our society itself. Its shares should not be forever scattered among 49 subscribers, Ruth Hawk, Henry, and me. If the foundation could acquire these outstanding shares, the book could be placed in trust for AA as a whole. The proceeds of the book would become tax-free if the cash shareholders were paid off, and they could no longer kick about the book's income being used to run the AA office. Trustee A. Leroy Chipman conceived the idea of borrowing enough money from Mr. Rockefeller, two of his sons, and the dinner guests to clear away certain debts and to buy all Works Publishing's shares, except Henry's and mine, from the cash subscribers at par. Every one of the cash subscribers gladly consented to this. They were happy to get out even. Mr. Chipman thereupon raised a total of $8,000, to be repaid to Mr. Rockefeller and the others out of book profits at a later date. The subscribers turned in their shares, received their money, and placed our foundation in possession of a 1/3 interest in Works Publishing. A few of the subscribers, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, were extra generous. Some sent all, and some half, of the money they had received back to the foundation as gifts. That left 2/3 interest in Works Publishing still coming to Henry and me. Seeing the necessity of the situation, I agreed to turn my 200 shares over to the foundation. But poor Henry, still drinking, was not easily convinced. For a long time he resisted all our pleas. One day, completely broke and very shaky, he turned up at the VC Street office. He pointed out that most of our office furniture still belonged to him, particularly the huge desk and the overstuffed chair. This gave us an idea. Supposing, we said, that the foundation would buy his furniture for, say, $200, would he then turn his Works Publishing stock over to the trustees? Henry finally consented and signed the necessary paper promising to do this. As a matter of fact, we had once before allowed Henry money on his furniture in order to help him out. But the trustees gravely produced still another $200, Henry turned in his stock, I turned in mine, and that is how the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous, through its trustees, came to own the big book. There was a slow but steady growth of our society during 1940. As new groups were started, local newspapers began to print articles about this strange new fellowship. These pieces helped us greatly. Lois and Ruth each had started scrapbooks, and they happily pasted up the clippings as they came in. Groups were well underway in big towns like Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and many smaller towns had equally promising beginnings. Cleveland continued its phenomenal boom which had begun the year before. The New York clubhouse could hardly seat its meetings. In Akron, Dr. Bob had begun the historic partnership with Sister Ignatia in St. Thomas Hospital. Thus AA rolled along until the spring of 1941, when we could count 2,000 members, a gain of 1,200 in a single year. We thought this was good going, but actually we had not seen anything yet. We were on the threshold of the event that made Alcoholics Anonymous a national institution overnight. Dr. A. Wieshammer, already champion of AA in Philadelphia, had drawn our fellowship to the attention of Curtis Bach, one of the owners of the Saturday Evening Post. At first the editorial board of the Post was dubious. But Mr. Bach had seen some of our Philadelphia members and had heard about their recovery at first hand. He knew whereof he spoke. And the next thing we knew, Mr. Jack Alexander, a star feature writer for the Post, appeared at our VC Street office. Knowing the circulation and prestige of the Saturday Evening Post, we were thrown into great excitement. Jack is an excellent reporter, and he by no means went overboard at once. The smell and taste of the Jersey rackets which he had just been investigating were still fresh to him. Seeing this, we gave him the most exhaustive briefing on Alcoholics Anonymous any writer has ever had. First he met our trustees and New York people, and then we towed him all over the country. Finally Jack said that he had enough, he was ready to write. But a serious difficulty arose. The Saturday Evening Post wanted pictures. Indeed it said it must have them. It was all right, they said, for Dr. Bob, myself, and other alcoholics to be called by other than their real names. But pictures they had to have, and some of them had to be on the sensational side. We objected that this might keep people away. Finally the Post said, no pictures, no article. The choice was ours, and it was a hard one. Over the protests of a good many conservative and fearful members, we told the Post to go ahead. It was a crucial decision which happily turned out to be the right one, that is, for the time being. The article appeared in the March 1, 1941, issue. Jack's extensive investigation and his remarkable capacity for sympathy and rapport with us produced a piece which had immense impact. By mail and telegram a deluge of pleas for help and orders for the book Alcoholics Anonymous, first in hundreds and then in thousands, hit Box 658. Ruth and I laughed as we remembered the day less than 2 years before when the postal clerk had handed us those jeering postcards from the doctors. Pawing at random through the incoming mass of heartbreaking appeals, we found ourselves crying, what on earth could we do with them? We were really swamped. We saw that we must have help. So we rounded up every AA woman and every AA wife who could use a typewriter. The upper floor of the 24th Street Club was converted into an emergency headquarters. For days Ruth and the volunteers tried to answer the ever-increasing tide of mail. They were almost tempted into using form letters. But experience had shown that this would not do at all. A warm personal communication must be sent to every prospect and his family. The peak of the flood finally passed, but the regular correspondence traffic through headquarters remained so great that we saw we would have to have permanent paid help. Volunteers could not handle the situation. We also realized that these increased demands upon the office could not be met out of book income. So for the first time we asked the AA groups to help. Following the Post piece, Trustees Howard and Burt went on the road, one to Philadelphia and Washington, the other to Akron and Cleveland. They asked that all AA groups contribute to a special fund in the foundation which would be earmarked for AA office expenses only. The contributions would be entirely voluntary. As a measuring stick, it was suggested that each group send in $1 per member per year. Gradually group funds began to trickle in, and we were able to add 2 regular paid workers to the staff. The AA tradition of self-support began to be a reality. The net book income could now go into the foundation. Whenever the groups failed to meet office expenses, this reserve fund could plug the deficit, as it frequently did for many years. The book Alcoholics Anonymous was not only helping to save alcoholics, it became the financial cornerstone of the headquarters and the guarantor of our solvency. At the end of 1941, when the group secretaries made their reports, we found that the membership had jumped to 8,000, an increase of 6,000 over 1940. We had begun to reach into Canada and into foreign lands. Everywhere we were growing rapidly. In many ways 1941 can be reckoned as the most exciting year in our history. We paid little attention to the low-lying clouds on the horizon which would soon involve us in storms. AA was just entering its fearful and wonderful time of adolescence, a phase which was to last almost 15 years. The pins on our office wall map showed scores of new groups springing up every week. Sometimes experienced AAs moved away from established centers to make their homes in other cities. Such localities were the lucky ones. But in most cases the newly formed groups had no experienced guidance whatever, except for the AA book, an occasional traveler, and correspondence with headquarters. Their worries and problems seemed endless. Committees quarreled, new clubs had unheard of headaches, orators held forth, groups split wide open. Some members turned professional, selling AA therapy for money to new prospects. Then in one of our larger centers the amazing story got around at the foundation and the New York office, and the book Alcoholics Anonymous were nothing but a huge racket for which Mr. John D. Rockefeller had foolishly fallen. At the height of this commotion a few AAs set up a dinner in the city where these rumors had the largest currency. Dr. Bob and I were asked to speak. The dinner was not any too well attended and the usual good cheer seemed mysteriously lacking. When the festivities were over, the chairman of all the groups in town conducted Dr. Bob and me to a hotel parlor. There they produced an attorney and a certified public accountant. They had been hearing awful stories about the foundation. They had heard that the book Alcoholics Anonymous was making vast sums of money, that Dr. Bob and I shared profits of $64,000 the year before. They believed that I, the Wall Street promoter, had my truck backed right up to Mr. John D. Rockefeller's strongbox and had persuaded him to fill it with coin for me and my friends. The interrogating committee let us know that a member from their city had met one of our trustees in New York who was said to have confirmed these appalling reports. This incredible but more than half-believed fantasy hit Dr. Bob and me quite hard. Fortunately I happened to have with me a certified audit of all of our affairs from the beginning. This showed that Dr. Bob, though he had been assigned a royalty, had never received any because his money was needed for the AA office work. He was still on a $30 a week stipend from the Rockefeller dinner. Like Dr. Bob, I received $30 a week from the dinner guests, and since the Post article I had begun drawing $25 a week from the publishing company, which had seemed justified from the book sales. My total income was $55 a week. The foundation itself still had practically no cash balance. The group contributions coming into it were promptly spent on the office in order to carry on there. The investigating committee's accountant read our modest financial statement aloud and testified to its correctness. The committee was crestfallen and we received an apology. The committee's chairman explained that the meeting had been called to set the record straight, that few of the committee members had actually believed the stories. He promised that he and his fellows would do all that they could to stop the spreading of these tales. But they never quite succeeded. The racket talk went on for years in that region. It was a very good experience for Dr. Bob and me. It obliged us to carefully re-examine our status and seek the counsel of friends. This was one of the test cases out of which AA's tradition respecting professionalism and paid workers was evolved. It was certain that I could not continue full-time nor Bob devote more than half his working hours to AA, unless we both had some definite source of steady income. We could not expect the dinner guests to bolster us up indefinitely. That would be contrary to the then-forming tradition of no contributions from the outside world. Neither could he and I receive group funds, which were already pledged to the support of the headquarters office. Profits of the book were all going into the Foundation Reserve Fund and we had no business to touch them either. So royalties from the book, provided the sales ever got large enough, seemed to be the only answer to the problem. In this way we might be recompensed for authorship and for the labor of putting the publishing company together. But would this constitute professionalism within the meaning of our growing tradition? Some members said that this would make us professionals, we would be making money out of AA. But our experience elsewhere had begun to indicate that this was not necessarily so. Our clubs were paying for caretakers, most of them AA members. They were not paid anything for their 12th step work, but they were recompensed as janitors and cooks. We simply had to have their full-time services. Our New York office had just engaged an alcoholic staff member, full-time. Was she a professional AA? Obviously not. She was being paid for special services, as a secretary. Ever since the book project started, my own thinking had gone from one extreme to the other. Sometimes I had felt that I should hang on to my one-third stock interest and have my royalty too. I was entitled, I thought, to all the financial reward that my work on the book business justified. At other times I felt that I should not take a cent, no matter what difficulties that might cause Lois and me. Shortly after the financial investigation episode, Father Ed Dowling, our Jesuit friend from St. Louis, turned up in New York. Still puzzled, I put the case up to him. He asked, "Do you think AA requires your full-time efforts?" I replied, "Yes, I think it does, perhaps indefinitely." Then he inquired, "Could you become a paid therapist, taking money for 12-step work?" I told him that this issue had been settled long since. Most emphatically I could not, regardless of the consequences, nor could any other AA member. "Well, Bill," said Father Ed, "if you were the only one concerned, you could certainly start wearing a hair shirt and take nothing. But what about Lois? Once upon a time you made a marriage contract to support her. Suppose you put her on the charity of friends so that you can do a service organization job for AA, free. Would that be the kind of support your marriage contract called for? I should think the royalties would be the best bet." This meant that Dr. Bob and I must certainly never accept money for 12-step work, but that we could be recompensed for special services. We both accepted Father Ed's down-the-middle advice and have stuck by it ever since, and I am glad to say this status for Dr. Bob and me was later accepted as correct in principle by our entire fellowship. In early 1942, non-alcoholic secretary Ruth Hawk left us to be married, carrying the affectionate wishes of thousands of members. The work of that sturdy little pioneer of the book Alcoholics Anonymous and AA's first headquarters set us an example that will never be forgotten. She was replaced by Bobby B., who became AA's National Secretary No. 2. Bobby's complete loyalty and devotion and her unbelievable energy and capacity for hard work were priceless helps during the confused and hazardous years which now lay ahead of us. Just before Ruth left, a news clipping whose content was to become famous was called to our attention by a New York member, Newsman Jack. It was an obituary notice from a New York paper. Underneath a routine account of the one who had died there appeared these words, "God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and wisdom to know the difference." Never had we seen so much AA in so few words. While Ruth and I were admiring the prayer, and wondering how to use it, friend Howard walked into the office. Confirming our own ideas, he exclaimed, "We ought to print this on cards and drop one into every piece of mail that goes out of here. I'll pay for the first printing." For several years afterward we followed his suggestion, and with amazing speed the Serenity Prayer came into general use and took its place alongside our two other favorites, the Lord's Prayer and the Prayer of St. Francis. No one can tell for sure who first wrote the Serenity Prayer. Some say it came from the early Greeks, others think it was from the pen of an anonymous English poet, still others claim it was written by an American naval officer, and Jack Alexander, who once researched the matter, attributes it to the Reverend Reinhold Niebuhr of the Union Theological Seminary. Anyhow, we have the prayer and it is said thousands of times daily. We count its writer among our great benefactors. Our phenomenal expansion soon brought us face to face with the very important problem of public relations. The national spotlight was now on us, we had to begin dealing with the public on a large scale. Public ill will could stunt our growth or even bring it to a standstill. Public confidence could swell our ranks to numbers of which we had only dreamed before. The Saturday Evening Post piece had proved this. Public relations was not only a big problem but a very delicate one. Any blunders that could arouse general prejudice might prolong the suffering of many and cost the lives of some. A carefully thought-out public relations policy had to be formed and put into operation. Prime consideration was given to our relations with medicine and religion. Under no circumstances must we get into competition with either. If we appeared to be a new religious sect, we would certainly be in trouble. And if we moved into the medical field as such, there would be more trouble. And if we moved into the medical field as such, there would be more trouble. So we began to emphasize the fact that AA was a way of life that conflicted with no one's religious belief. We let the doctors know how much we needed hospitalization, and we suggested to psychiatrists and drying out places the advantage of cooperating with us. At all times, religion would be the province of the individual and of the clergyman, and the practice of medicine would be for our friends the doctors. As alcoholic laymen, we were simply supplying the much-needed and long-lost missing link. These public relations attitudes have been maintained over the years since, and they have brought heartwarming results. Today we have the unqualified support of nearly every religious denomination. Most medical practitioners who understand AA send their alcoholic patients to us. Our members speak frequently before religious gatherings and medical societies. And the men of medicine and religion are often seen at AA's open meetings. But medicine and religion, important as they are, prove to be only a fraction of our total public relations problem. We also had to determine how best to cooperate with the press, radio, motion pictures, and more recently television, how to deal with employers who wanted special help, what would be the right attitude toward the field of alcohol education, research, and rehabilitation, private and public. What would we say to prisons and hospitals who wanted AA groups within their walls? What were we to tell AAs who went into some of these fields and who were then tempted to capitalize publicly upon the AA name for advertising or fund-raising? What would we say or do if AA were ever widely exploited, defamed, or attacked by outsiders? Workable solutions to all these and many more such problems had to be found, or AA might suffer serious consequences. Finding answers to these public relations puzzlers has been a long process. After much trial and error, sometimes punctuated by painful mistakes, the attitudes and practices that would work best for us emerged. The basic ones can be seen today in the AA traditions: 100% anonymity at the public level, no use of the AA name for the benefit of other causes, however worthy, no endorsements or alliances, the carrying of the message as the single purpose for Alcoholics Anonymous, no professionalism, public relations by the principle of attraction rather than promotion. These were some of the hard-learned lessons. It was natural that our board of trustees and the headquarters office became the focal point around which the AA traditions were formed. Problems of every description poured in upon us, but by 1945 a considerable degree of order had come out of what had been a chaotic situation. On all sides the membership of our society asked for the experience and guidance of the New York office in solving their problems. Things finally began to run so smoothly that the average AA member has taken our World Service record for granted. Until recently these headquarters services were largely invisible to him. Nevertheless, this unseen activity has surely been responsible for much of our growth and unity. Over the years the functioning of the foundation, the wide use of the AA book, the expansion of pamphlet literature, the answering of thousands of pleas for help, the response to requests for guidance on group problems, the working out of our relations with the public, all these constituted a growing service to the whole world of AA. At long last our society really had begun to function as a whole. The 1941 to 1945 period brought still other developments. Our downtown VC Street office was moved to 415 Lexington Avenue, just opposite Grand Central Station. We made this move because the need for serving the many AA travelers through New York had become urgent. Our new location near Grand Central brought us into contact with visitors who, for the first time, began to see Alcoholics Anonymous as a vision for the whole world. Thousands of AAs, their families, their friends, their clergymen, their doctors, and their employers have since visited the New York headquarters. The growth of Alcoholics Anonymous continued at a pace which was to us sometimes staggering. By almost geometrical progression the multiplication went on year after year. We no longer counted by thousands, we began to reckon by tens of thousands. But this was not the whole story. For the first time we had begun to sense that the character of AA was changing. We were beginning to have success with milder alcoholics and even some potential alcoholics. In the first years, those of us who sobered up in AA had been grim and utterly hopeless cases, almost without exception, but now younger folks began to appear. Lots of people turned up who still had jobs and homes and health and even good social standing. These in their turn were able to persuade others like themselves of the need for AA. Of course it was necessary for these types of newcomers to hit bottom emotionally. But we found they did not have to hit every possible bottom there was in order to admit that they were licked. We began to develop a conscious technique of raising the bottom and hitting them with it. When one of these mild cases arrived at the conviction that he already had the principal symptoms of alcoholism, that was usually enough. He hit bottom then and there and so was spared years of anguish. In something of the same fashion this idea began to work out with other kinds of prospects. In the beginning we could not sober up women. They were different, they said. But when they saw other women get well, they slowly followed suit. The derelict, the rich man, the socialite, all these once thought AA was not for them. So did certain people of other races and tongues and creeds. But when they clearly saw the alcoholic tragedy for which they were headed, they could forget their differences and join AA. As these new trends came into full view, we were overjoyed. Today more than half of AA's membership consists of mild cases and those who once thought they were different. Then the spread to foreign lands began. This development brought us a whole new set of problems to solve. Each new distant beachhead had to go through its flying blind and pioneering period just as we had in the United States. Soon we were running into language barriers, and more of our pamphlet literature had to be translated into other tongues. In addition, our foreign friends raised new and special doubts. Maybe AA was just a Yankee gadget that would be no good for Ireland, England, Holland, Scandinavia, Australia, and the Pacific. Since their countries were so different, maybe their alcoholics were different too. Will AA work in our cultures? They asked. We became heavily involved in correspondence, much helped by our American members in New York who could translate for us. We searched out and briefed AA travelers going abroad. Gradually headway was made. It was a long time, however, before we knew for sure that AA could cross the barriers of distance, race, creed, and language. But today, the AA map shows our society in more than 70 countries and U.S. possessions. We now feel sure that it is only a question of time until every alcoholic in the world may well have as good a chance to recover as we have had here in America. Serving the foreign groups has become a major headquarters activity, although we have scarcely scratched the total possibilities so far. Good translations of AA literature are ever more urgently needed. But able helpers have always turned up to meet that need. Some 10 years ago, Frank M. translated the AA book into Spanish. He worked daytimes as interpreter for a New York importer and at night he labored over his love, the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Today his translation is the foundation cornerstone for AA in Spanish-speaking countries. Somewhat later certain Quebec members did an equally fine piece of work, this time in French. At Oslo, we hope our big book will soon be published in Norwegian. Because of the language similarity, the Danes and the Swedes will also be able to read our basic text when it appears in Norwegian. Many of our pamphlets have already been published in still other tongues, notably German, Dutch, and Finnish. We strive constantly to cross more language barriers, thus throwing new lifelines to those who don't yet know that there is a way out. Since AA was growing so fast, headquarters had to grow, too. Thousands of group contributions and our increasing literature sales soon demanded a full-time bookkeeper. Getting out our directory of AA groups began to be a job rather like publishing a suburban telephone book. Letter and Cardex files began to appear in rows. More alcoholic staff members had to be engaged. As the work was divided among them, departments began to be created. Today's office is departmentalized to cover the following activities: group relations, domestic and foreign, public relations, general service conference, office management, mailing, packing, accounting, stenographic, and special service to prison and hospital groups. Fortunately the office did not have to grow as fast as AA did. The bill would never have been paid if it had. AA was getting so big that we could not possibly educate all members on what headquarters was doing. Many groups, preoccupied with their own affairs, failed to help us at all. Less than half of them contributed anything. We were plagued by constant deficits in contributions which luckily could be plugged up with money from the sale of the big book and our growing pamphlet literature. Without this book income we would have folded up entirely. The year 1944 brought a vital development. In New York City a few literary and news-minded AAs began to issue a monthly publication. This original group consisted of Marty, Priscilla, Lois K., Abbott, Maeve, and Kay. Besides these, Grace O. and her husband turned up among its moving spirits. They called their magazine The Grapevine. It was by no means the first local AA bulletin or magazine. The Cleveland Central Bulletin, the Los Angeles Eye-Opener, and several others had preceded it. But the Grapevine caught on nationally. After the first few months it encountered a strange kind of difficulty. It turned out that the FBI for a long time had published a sheet called The Grapevine. It was largely devoted to keeping FBI men up to date on the doings of their great service. Things were finally ironed out when we began to call our monthly magazine the AA Grapevine. With this minor difficulty overcome, our Grapevine grew and grew. The circulation has since risen to more than 40,00016 copies a month. The Grapevine is the mirror of AA thought and action, worldwide. It is a sort of magic carpet on which all of us can travel from one distant AA outpost to another, and thus it has become a wonderful exchange medium of our current thought and experience. After a while the Grapeviners discovered that they had a bear by the tail. It was always fun to get in the material and edit the pieces, but licking all those postage stamps and mailing thousands of copies finally became an impossible job. So they asked that the foundation take over. When the trustees inquired of the AA groups if they would like to make the Grapevine their international magazine, their answer was yes. The journal was incorporated, and 2 foundation trustees were seated on its board of directors, along with the editors. The Grapevine had to have full-time help. This created a mounting deficit and again funds from the big book had to come to the rescue. Without this aid the magazine would have suspended publication. Even more than the headquarters office, the AA Grapevine can always use a large staff of volunteers. Only the managing editor, her assistants, the head of the subscription department, and a few routine workers are on the payroll. The editor, the editorial board, the artists, and many writers always do a vast amount of volunteer work on every issue. Without such expert volunteers we could have no magazine at all. Were we to pay them for their services, the bill would be prohibitive. How these busy professional men and women are able to meet the Grapevine deadline every month will always be a mystery to the rest of us. It is one of the most consistent and brilliant volunteer efforts that AA has seen. Even as early as 1945, the solution of group problems by correspondence had put a large volume of work on headquarters. Letters to metropolitan AA centers filled our bulging files. It seemed as if every contestant in every group argument wrote us during this confused and exciting period. The basic ideas for the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous came directly out of this vast correspondence. In late 1945 a good AA friend suggested that all this mass of experience might be codified into a set of principles which could offer tested solutions to all our problems of living and working together and of relating our society to the world outside. If we had become sure enough of where we really stood on such matters as membership, group autonomy, singleness of purpose, non-endorsement of other enterprises, professionalism, public controversy, and anonymity in its several aspects, then such a set of principles could be written. A code of traditions could not, of course, ever become rule or law. But it might act as a guide for our trustees, headquarters people, and especially for AA groups with growing pains. Being at the center of things, we of headquarters would have to do the job. Aided by my helpers there, I set to work. The traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous were first published in the so-called long form in the Grapevine of May, 1946. Additional Grapevine pieces then explained the traditions in detail. These continued to appear for several months. Later on, these articles were incorporated in a pamphlet called AA Tradition. All of our headquarters staff members and many group secretaries still rely on well-thumbed and battered copies of this first tradition pamphlet for their guidance in times of trouble. At the foundation, meanwhile, we had taken a significant action that was incorporated in these traditions. In 1945 we wrote Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and the 1940 dinner guests that we would no longer need their financial help. The book royalties could now look after Dr. Bob and me, group contributions could pay the general office expenses. If these were insufficient, the reserve accumulated out of literature sales could meet the deficit. This meant that we had finally declared for full self-support. Since that time AA's Board of Trustees has steadfastly refused outside contributions. When first published, the traditions got a mixed reception. Only groups in dire trouble took them seriously. But in some quarters there was a violent reaction against them, especially in groups that had long lists of protective rules and regulations. At the other extreme, there was much apathetic indifference. Still others said, "Let's keep AA simple." To them, the 12 traditions seemed only a needless expression of the hopes and fears of General Headquarters for AA's future. At this point I began to travel and talk a lot about the new principles. The members listened, but were obviously bored. After a while I received letters like this: "Bill, we would love to have you come and speak. Tell us where you used to hide your bottles and tell us about that hot flash spiritual experience of yours. But please don't talk any more about those damn traditions. Time has changed all that." Several years later it was recognized that the 12 traditions were going to be just as necessary to the life of our society as the 12 steps were to the life of each member. We saw that the AA traditions were the key to the unity, the functioning, and even the survival of Alcoholics Anonymous. In reality I had not been the author of the traditions at all. I had merely put them on paper in such a way as to mirror principles which had already been developed in AA group experience. AA's general headquarters, its trustees, and its staff had actually made the formulation of these vital principles possible. Had there been no headquarters to bring our group problems into focus, the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous could never have been written. By this time AA had begun to find favor in the world of medicine. 2 of America's great medical associations took unprecedented steps in recognizing us. In 1944 the Medical Society of the State of New York had invited me to read a paper at its annual meeting. After the reading, 3 of the physicians present, Dr. Harry Thibaut, Dr. Kirby Collier, and Dr. Foster Kennedy, stood up and gave AA the firmest kind of endorsement. The society itself went still farther. It published the paper in its journal and permitted AA to make reprints. Large numbers of this pamphlet have since been distributed all over the world, carrying the assurance to doctors everywhere that AA is medically sound. In 1949 the American Psychiatric Association did exactly the same thing. I read a paper at its annual meeting in Montreal. This was a still more exacting assignment, and I frankly wondered what I should say. I wound up by describing the spiritual experience as we understand it in AA. As I read, I doubted if even a handful of the audience could possibly agree with the views expressed in my paper. To my astonishment there was a sustained round of applause. But this was not at all a tribute to me or to the contents of my paper, it was instead a tribute to Alcoholics Anonymous, a tribute to a way of life which had worked for alcoholics when other approaches had failed. This generous response was evidence that our friends the psychiatrists were being much more tolerant of us than we had been of them. If we ourselves became more open-minded, then far greater cooperation with this profession would be assured. The association promptly confirmed the view of its members in Montreal. My paper was carried in the American Journal of Psychiatry and we were permitted to reprint it in a pamphlet, now entitled Alcoholism: The Illness. Our standing with the psychiatric profession has increased greatly since that time. State and county medical associations began to ask AA members to make appearances before them. All these medical papers have served our foreign groups especially well. saving them the years that were once required here in America to demonstrate AA's worth to physicians. The medical aspect of alcoholism includes the problem of hospitalization, and here also great progress has been made. Many hospitals have been reluctant to take alcoholics at all. State and provincial institutions usually have required alcoholics to stay for long periods of commitment. Therefore it has been difficult, and it still is, to persuade the average general hospital to take in AA prospects for short periods of treatment and to grant sponsors the necessary visiting privileges in cooperation with our local intergroup associations. It is good to report that this condition is rapidly changing for the better. Our pioneering activity in this field, together with the use which AA headquarters has been able to make of that experience, has a special interest for us all. 2 American hospitals have afforded fine examples of how medicine and AA can best cooperate. At St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, Dr. Bob, the wonderful Sister Ignatia, and the hospital staff presided over an alcoholic ward which had treated several thousand alcoholics by the time of Dr. Bob's death in 1950. And beginning in 1945, Knickerbocker Hospital in New York provided an AA ward under the care of our first friend in medicine, Dr. William D. Silkworth, who was assisted with rare devotion and skill by Nurse Teddy. By 1954, 10,000 alcoholics had been referred to Knickerbocker by the New York Intergroup Association and had passed through this ward, the majority on their way to freedom. Since proper hospitalization is one of AA's greatest problems, the New York headquarters continues to pass on the knowledge gained from this early experience, along with its many subsequent developments and ramifications, to AA groups all over the world. Meanwhile, a great tide of public approval, stimulated by AA's friends of press, radio, and in recent times television, began to sweep in upon us, and it has never ceased. Each month a clipping service feeds our headquarters scrapbooks with a very large amount of material. Writers constantly ask headquarters to check their manuscripts. AA members are helped to appear anonymously on radio and TV programs. The making of arrangements for publicity has become a constantly increasing activity of our AA office. How many lives have been saved, how many years of misery have thus been averted for thousands of alcoholics and their families, only God knows. To maintain these ever-lengthening lifelines of service, our office had to go on expanding. In 1950 we moved to 141 East 44th Street, still closer to Grand Central. Today this office is presided over by Chairman Hank, on part-time, and 6 fine staff secretaries. These paid staff members are greatly helped by volunteer committeemen who are experts in law, finance, and public relations. On the routine service staff about 12 non-alcoholics look after bookkeeping, filing, and stenography, and 2 receptionists preside over the outer office. Their visitors see the walls covered with sectional maps showing the worldwide reach of our fellowship. On a table stands a winged victory, symbol of the Lasker Award given to AA by the American Public Health Association in 1951. The editorial offices of the Grapevine are on the floor below. Here Editor Don and his volunteer assistants confer with the managing editor and her assistant to meet the monthly deadline. Farther downtown, where rents are cheaper, there is a large floor space where the circulation department looks after the Grapevine's 40,000 readers and their needs. 3 blocks away from the main office we have a good-sized loft space where all shipping and mailing is done. This activity now runs into tons of material a month. 6 busy lads spend full time at it. Last year they shipped about 40,000 books and hundreds of thousands of pamphlets, many of them newly designed and edited largely through the work of Ralph, our consultant on pamphlet literature. They mailed about 30,000 letters and bulletins and did huge quantities of mimeographing. Down one side of the long packing room, on shelves reaching to the ceiling, are scores of boxed-up files. These are the old records of our headquarters, going clear back to the days at Vesey Street. The world story of AA is hidden in these boxes, waiting only to be searched out, and we have just begun the job. In a partitioned-off corner office near the files our research librarian is digging into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. In addition to the present brief sketch, I hope that someday the full-length history of Alcoholics Anonymous will be written. Because of this research activity, it is now certain that the basic facts of AA's growth and development never can become distorted. Such is one of our newest undertakings. No description of AA's world services would be complete without acknowledgement of all that has been contributed by our non-alcoholic trustees. Over the years they have given a great amount of time and effort. Theirs has been the wisdom that has caused our affairs to make financial sense, and frequently in times of heated debate they have headed off the rash decisions that we volatile alcoholics would surely have made. Some of them, like Mr. Jack Alexander, Mr. Fulton Ausler, Mr. Leonard V. Harrison, and Mr. Bernard B. Smith, have given much to us out of their special fields of literature, social service, finance, and law. Their example is being followed by more recent trustees such as Mr. Frank Golden, Dr. John Norris, Mr. Archibald Roosevelt, and Mr. Ivan Underwood. The very special contributions of my brother-in-law, Dr. Leonard V. Strong, Jr., Mr. Willard Richardson, Mr. A. Leroy Chipman, and Mr. Frank B. Amos have already been described. And a little farther on we shall consider at some length the vital role that Mr. Leonard Harrison played as longtime chairman of the foundation during the uncertain period of our adolescence. That period, 1945 to 1950, was one of immense strain and test. We were confronted by three grave issues. The first had to do with money, the second with anonymity, and, most dangerous of all, there was the question of what was to become of Alcoholics Anonymous when its old-timers and founders had gone. In 1945 we had begun to decline outside contributions, but another similar hazard soon presented itself. Wealthy people, some of them AA members, began to insert large bequests in their wills with a direction that these funds be given to the Alcoholic Foundation in trust for Alcoholics Anonymous. One of these bequests became available during a period when AA's headquarters was in severe financial straits. At one point group contributions to the office failed to meet the bill by $2,000 a month and the grapevine deficits were almost half that amount. The question was then asked, even if we cannot take money from living contributors, what reason is there for not accepting it from deceased ones? But after long debate and soul-searching, the trustees finally turned all these bequests away, thereby consolidating and cementing the AA tradition of self-support for all time to come. To thoughtful AAs everywhere this action of the trustees brought a deep new feeling of relief and security. A real peril had been averted. The intense drive that most of us alcoholics have for money, prestige, and power then crashed into the open by way of broken anonymity at the public level. This development of the 1945 to 1950 period was made even more dangerous by the fact that most of the anonymity breakers meant well. Having done some anonymity breaking at an earlier period myself, I could well appreciate their good intentions. Sometimes these folks wanted to use the AA name publicly in order to help other good causes. Sometimes they just wanted their names and pictures in the papers, always, of course, to help AA. They actually believed that being photographed with the governor would really help. Finally we saw that the risk to AA would be appalling if all our power drivers finally got loose at the public level. Scores of them were already doing it. So AA headquarters got to work. We wrote remonstrances, kind ones, of course, to every breaker. We sent letters to nearly all press, radio, and publishing outlets, explaining why AAs should not break their anonymity before the general public. Group feeling, combined with the headquarters' efforts, finally squeezed the anonymity breakers down to a mere handful within a few years. Had this tendency not been checked, the whole character of our society could have changed, and its future could have been fearfully compromised. In 1947 Dr. Bob had been stricken by an ailment that we all knew might prove fatal. At headquarters this gave us plenty to think about. The main link between our world services and AA itself had been Dr. Bob, our secretarial staff, and me. To our worldwide fellowship its devoted board of trustees was scarcely known at all. Not one AA in 1,000 could name even half of them. When death or disability finally took us few old-timers out of the picture, where would that leave the trustees and the headquarters? A single blunder on their part might cause a failure of confidence that could not be repaired. Lacking the moral and financial support of the groups, the whole headquarters effort might collapse completely. Our services might never be reinstated because nobody could be authorized to do the job. It was evident that here was a worldwide movement that had no direct access to its own principal service affairs. The trustees had authority over our services, AA itself had no authority. The simple trusteeship had been the ideal guardian for our infancy and adolescence, but how in future years could it possibly go on functioning as it had? This situation had been a matter of great concern to me ever since the publication of the Traditions in 1946. I had sent the trustees many memorandums on the subject. There had been considerable discussion. At first we had talked vaguely about a hand-picked advisory council or an elected conference of some sort. But since there was no imminent danger, no action was taken. When Dr. Bob became ill, I began to feel the serious urgency of the problem. So did Mr. Bernard Smith and one or two of the others. But the majority of the board did not share our apprehension. They felt that creating a conference or even an advisory council would entail unnecessary politics and expense. The foundation had done well for 10 years, so why could it not go on in just the same way? Typically alcoholic, I became very excited, and this turned the passive resistance of my fellow workers into solid opposition. A serious rift developed between me and the alcoholic members of the board, and as the months went by the situation became worse and worse. With much reason, they resented my sledgehammer tactics and my continued violence. As the tempest increased, so did my blistering memorandums to the board. One of them was an amazing composition following a long plea for an elected AA conference and other reforms, and after having pointed out that the trustees had all the authority there was, with no responsibility to anyone, even to Dr. Bob and me, I finished the memo with this astonishing sentence: when I was in law school, the largest book I studied was the one on trusts. I must say, gentlemen, that it was mostly a long and melancholy account of the malfeasances and misfeasances of boards of trustees. I had written this to a group of the best friends I had in the world, people who had devoted themselves to AA and to me without stint. Obviously I was on a dry bender of the worst possible sort. This sizzling memorandum nearly blew the foundation apart. Our non-alcoholic friends were dumbfounded. My alcoholic colleagues among the opposition trustees darkly murmured that I must have gone crazy. They felt sure of it when I set out on the road in 1948 to sound out among the groups the possibility of an elected conference to which the board of trustees could eventually become accountable. Soon after I left on my travels, the alcoholic trustees got hold of old-timers in Akron, New York, and Cleveland to decide in conclave what could be done about the situation, and especially about me. They supposed that out on the road I was widely airing the dispute and looking for backing. Happily I refrained from doing this. And the conclave of old-timers exercised some restraint too. They merely advised the board that things were all right as they were, that no elected conference or advisory council was necessary, and that there was no need for any of the internal changes that I had suggested. But although I had not generally raised the issue among the groups, I did come back with the conviction that they would like to have full access to their own affairs through an elected conference. Of this much I was now certain. By 1949 Dr. Bob was definitely failing. At the office Bobby, caught squarely in the middle of this fracas about the conference, was already exhausted to the cracking point. I must say, gentlemen, that it was mostly a long and melancholy account of the malfeasances and misfeasances of boards of trustees. I had written this to a group of the best friends I had in the world, people who had devoted themselves to AA and to me without stint. Obviously I was on a dry bender of the worst possible sort. This sizzling memorandum nearly blew the foundation apart. Our non-alcoholic friends were dumbfounded. My alcoholic colleagues among the opposition trustees darkly murmured that I must have gone crazy. They felt sure of it when I set out on the road in 1948 to sound out among the groups the possibility of an elected conference to which the board of trustees could eventually become accountable. Soon after I left on my travels, the alcoholic trustees got hold of old-timers in Akron, New York, and Cleveland to decide in conclave what could be done about the situation and especially about me. They supposed that out on the road I was widely airing the dispute and looking for backing. Happily I refrained from doing this. And the conclave of old-timers exercised some restraint too. They merely advised the board that things were all right as they were, that no elected conference or advisory council was necessary, and that there was no need for any of the internal changes that I had suggested. But although I had not generally raised the issue among the groups, I did come back with the conviction that they would like to have full access to their own affairs through an elected conference. Of this much I was now certain. By 1949 Dr. Bob was definitely failing. At the office Bobby, caught squarely in the middle of this fracas about the conference, was already exhausted to the cracking point. This was low ebb. Then, slowly the tide began to turn. Had it not been for our non-alcoholic friends on the board, I doubt if the impasse could ever have been resolved. As we entered 1950 this conflict had been going on almost 5 years. The two men who ultimately saved the situation were Mr. Leonard Harrison and Mr. Bernard Smith. Though Mr. Harrison did not then see the necessity for the elected conference, his unfailing tact and good sense, together with the respect and affection he had engendered among us all, were the qualities that kept our shaky foundation on its course. Most of the non-alcoholics on the board at the time had been institutional men. Bernard Smith, on the other hand, was a businessman and lawyer. From the time he had joined the board, 3 years earlier, he had always favored corporate management for the AA office and an elected conference to sit with the trustees as the final plan of service structure for Alcoholics Anonymous. At this critical juncture, Mr. Harrison appointed Bernard Smith as chairman of the trustees committee on the proposed conference. Considering their differences of opinion, this was a most magnanimous and generous act on Leonard's part. The recollection of it never fails to inspire me. Bernard Smith has a remarkable faculty for persuasion and negotiation. Moreover, his ideas about a conference had already taken a deeper hold than any of us realized. After the air had cleared somewhat, he took up the task of convincing the trustees committee on the conference. Following only 2 meetings he put this question to the committee: shall we set up this conference of delegates, or shall we forget about it? To my astonishment the committee unanimously said, let's give the conference a try. It seemed like a miracle. Just before this crucial decision Alcoholics Anonymous had taken another step toward worldwide unity and function. In the summer of 1950 we held our first international convention in Cleveland, Ohio. About 3,000 were in attendance. The highlights of this occasion were Dr. Bob's last appearance and the confirmation of our 12 traditions by the convention as the permanent platform of unity and function on which our fellowship would henceforth stand. The 12 traditions had already been reduced from the old, long form of 1946 to capsule statements which in length matched our familiar 12 steps of recovery. This had been done at the wise suggestion of Earl T., founder of our Chicago group. One day in 1947, or thereabouts, he turned up at my home with this excellent idea. After a week of wrestling with the problem of cutting down the long form, we came up with a first draft which much resembled the 12 traditions as they are today. After several months more of consultation and refining, the final draft was ready. The grapevine commenced to carry the newly stated traditions in every issue, and thus the average AA member was made tradition conscious. By the time the Cleveland Convention met, the understanding and approval of the traditions had become general throughout our society. At the Cleveland Convention we sensed that Dr. Bob was soon going to leave us and that many another early AA would soon follow him. The old order was changing. In the future we could no longer depend upon the authority and influence of our pioneering people for AA unity. Henceforth we would have to rely upon spiritual principles, as set forth in the 12 traditions. Several speakers presented the 12 traditions to the convention. I then summed them up and asked the convention for final approval. Today one can still listen, by means of a recording, to the convention's unanimous voice of consent. It was a fine hour in that month of July, 1950. Alcoholics Anonymous had passed its 15th milestone, its second legacy of tradition was secure. Dr. Bob was visibly relieved by my message, but he made no immediate comment. Though still up and around, he was desperately ill. Hard as it was going to be, I realized that I must press for his consent to the conference. I remember suggesting that if he and I did not act on this matter but continued our silence, we would still be taking action. If we both passed off the scene without making any move, everybody would suppose that the present state of affairs met with our full approval. If thereafter the headquarters should collapse for lack of conference linkage, the AAs could rightfully say, "Why didn't Dr. Bob and Bill tell us? Why didn't they give us a chance to look after our own business and policy?" I ventured the idea that we ought to call the conference anyhow, even if it was a failure at first. The movement's delegates could come down to New York and see what AA's world affairs were really like. They could then decide whether they would take responsibility or whether they would not. That would make it a movement decision, rather than one taken in silence by Dr. Bob and me. He continued to reflect, and I waited. Finally he looked up and said, "Bill, it has to be AA's decision, not ours. Let's call that conference." "It's fine with me." A few hours later I took my leave of Dr. Bob, knowing that the following week he was to undergo a very serious operation. Neither of us dared say what was in our hearts. We both knew that this might well be the last decision that we would ever make together. I went down the steps and then turned to look back. Bob stood in the doorway, tall and upright as ever. Some color had come back to his cheeks, and he was carefully dressed in a light gray suit. This was my partner, the man with whom I never had a hard word. The wonderful, old, broad smile was on his face as he said almost jokingly, "Remember, Bill, let's not louse this thing up. Let's keep it simple." I turned away, unable to say a word. That was the last time I ever saw him. Soon after I arrived home, the trustees approved the conference plan and gave me authority to proceed. The money cost of holding such a yearly affair was not an obstacle. Even if the outlay might be $20,000 annually, this would be only a few cents extra for each AA member, and well worth it. But how, in electing delegates, could we cut down destructive politics with all the usual struggles for prestige and vainglory? How many delegates would be needed and from where should they come? When they arrived in New York, how could they be related to the Board of Trustees? What would be their actual powers and duties? Whatever the plan, it had to be sound enough to work fairly well from the start. No blunders big enough to create a fiasco could be allowed. Consequently, it was with many misgivings that I began work on the draft of a detailed plan. Headquarters people and trustees alike made many fine suggestions. Helen B. of the office staff had a real flair for statesmanship in the best sense of the word, and she understood practical politicking too. Her assistance throughout proved invaluable. Though the conference might someday be enlarged to include the whole world, we felt that the first delegates should come from the US and Canada only. Each state and province might have one delegate each, with the provision that those containing heavy AA population could have additional representation. To give the conference continuity, the delegates would be divided into two panels, Panel 1 to be elected in 1951 and Panel 2 the following year. Hence only half the delegates would drop out at one time and the conference membership would rotate. Elections could take place at the largest centers of population in each state or province. Yet how could these assemblies of group representatives choose their committeemen and delegates without terrific political friction? As veterans of many a group hassle and intergroup brawl, we worried seriously about this. Then came a happy thought. We knew that many of our election troubles were caused by personal nominations, whether from the floor of a meeting or by a self-appointed committee from a back room. Another prime cause of grief was the hotly contested close election, which nearly always left behind a large and discontented minority. We therefore devised a scheme of choosing committeemen out of group assemblies by written ballot with no personal nominations at all. But the chief friction would most certainly center around the election of the delegate. How could that pressure be kept down? It was stipulated that each delegate must receive a 2/3 vote of his assembly for election. With a majority of this size, the minority could not kick very much. But suppose the contest was a neck-and-neck affair, with nobody able to get the 2/3 vote? Here we would have to invent something. Maybe the lead man and one or two of his runners-up might place their names in a hat and take their chances on a drawing. The winner of such a painless lottery would become the delegate. Since the high men in the running would almost always be good ones, we could not miss getting a fine panel of delegates by such a method. Of course these ideas were quite speculative. We dearly hoped they were going to work. But would they? It was felt that the elected delegates, meeting in New York in conference, should have very real authority. Therefore the tentative Charter 18 drawn for the conference provided that the delegates, on a two-thirds vote, could issue flat directives to the trustees. Even a simple majority could issue a strong suggestion to the trustees. Nevertheless, this type of suggestion would be a powerful one, because if it were not carried out, the discontented majority could return home and see that contributions to headquarters were cut. Under the proposed plan, it would also become traditional for the trustees to submit the names of all proposed board members to the conference for confirmation. This would give the conference an effective voice in the selection of trustees. Along with a temporary scheme for financing the new operation, we put these ideas and their detailed application into a pamphlet called the Third Legacy. We shipped 50,000 of these documents to the groups and asked them to form their assemblies for the election of committeemen and delegates. Fortified with the approval of the trustees and of Dr. Bob, I stumped the country for the Third Legacy plan, talking to large AA audiences and watching assemblies select their delegates in more than 24 states and provinces. I remember particularly the first tryout of the new plan in Boston. Before the meeting, some of the elder politicos made a microscopic examination of the whole scheme and came up with the verdict that it was going to work. This was comforting, since those folks in Boston knew politics as few of the rest of us did. Their interest was everywhere intense, and members turned out in force for the mass meeting where I highlighted the Third Legacy plan. When the area's group representatives finally met to elect their committeeman and the delegate, the proceedings were as unruffled as a mill pond. The committeemen were duly elected and seated in front of the assembly meeting. Then the assemblymen voted and voted, but nobody could get a two-thirds majority. At last it was decided that the names of the whole committee be dumped into the hat. And out of that traditional receptacle there was drawn a fine delegate. Everybody was elated, we knew the heat was off. Right there we had our first glimmer that AA had begun to move from partisan politics into true statesmanship. When the first General Service Conference met in April, 1951, we found that about a third of its delegates were real old-timers. The rest were active AAs sober 4 to 8 years. Best of all, the majority of them had been chosen by a two-thirds vote, only a few of the elections going to lot. It was tremendously encouraging. On their first day, the delegates inspected our headquarters, got acquainted with the service staff, and shook hands with the trustees. In the evening there was a briefing session under the name of "What's on Your Mind?" We answered questions of every description. The delegates began to feel at home. Seeing their quick understanding and confidence, our spirits rose. We all sensed that something momentous was happening, that this was a historic moment. One strenuous session followed another, morning, afternoon, and evening. The delegates inspected AA's finances and listened to reports from the Board of Trustees and from all of the services. There was warm but cordial debate on many questions of AA policy. The trustees submitted several of their own serious problems for the opinion of the conference. With real dispatch the delegates handled several tough puzzlers about which we at headquarters were in doubt. Though their advice was sometimes contrary to our own views, we saw they were frequently right. They were proving as never before that AA's tradition too was correct. Our group conscience could safely act as the sole authority and sure guide for Alcoholics Anonymous. As the delegates returned home, they carried this deep conviction with them. For example, at its very first session the conference had suggested that the Alcoholic Foundation ought to be renamed the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. But they would not hurry this matter. It was after 2 more years of careful consideration that this suggestion became a decision and was carried out. To their minds the word "foundation" had stood for charity, paternalism, and maybe big money. What had been good for our infancy would be no good for our future. Now that the General Service Conference was successfully launched upon its 5-year trial period, AA's fellowship and its headquarters entered a time of quiet progress and consolidation. The growing pains of our youth here in America had abated, and we no longer felt fearful when they began to recur in lands overseas. This heartening state of affairs was reflected in our trustees' meetings and in our daily work at headquarters. The final outlines of AA's structure of service could now be seen. Wonderful cooperation and effective work replaced the fear, indecision, and violent debate of earlier times. The board was again enlarged and new members, alcoholic and non-alcoholic, joined the ranks of trustee service. In the new conference we could begin to hear the voice of AA's conscience, worldwide. And we already knew that this voice could be relied upon. For the first time we seemed to fully understand what we were doing and where we were going. In this era of smooth sailing, death claimed 2 more of our old friends, Uncle Dick Richardson and Silky. Like Ann and Dr. Bob, these 2 died happily confident that AA was at last secure and on its way. What Willard W. Richardson and William D. Silkworth had left us in pioneering service and in love was a never-to-be-forgotten heritage. One more noteworthy event marked this period of quiet, the publication of AA's 12 Steps and 12 Traditions in 1953. This small volume is strictly a textbook which explains AA's 24 basic principles and their application, in detail and with great care. Helped by my editorial team, Betty L. and Tom P., I had begun work on this project in early 1952. The final draft was widely circulated among our friends of medicine and religion and also among many old-time AAs. This rigorous checkup was topped off by none other than Jack Alexander, who added the final editorial touch. For group distribution we published the volume ourselves, and our old friend Gene Exman of Harper offered favorable terms for distribution through his firm to bookstores. The response was far greater than expected. About 50,000 volumes are in circulation as of 1957. It is the general feeling that the book has deepened the meaning of our 12 steps as they can be applied to the individual's problem of daily living, and that our 12 traditions can now be better understood and used in guiding the life of our whole society. This new book was doubtless another sign and portent that AA was soon to come of full age. For us who staffed AA's services, these years of consolidation and promise will be remembered as among the best that we can ever know. As 1955 came into view, we became very confident that Alcoholics Anonymous was at last safe, that its future was assured. Everyone here at St. Louis knows that we have just published the 2nd edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Many of you have it in your hands already. Today, as we pass AA's 20th milestone, it is quite fitting that this long-pondered edition is now in readiness for the future. The scope and power of its case history section has been increased, but of course the old familiar text of the book stands unchanged. This edition contains an interesting review of what actually happened to the 28 pioneer authors who in 1939 wrote the first edition stories. We find that 23 of them made a recovery from alcoholism. Of these, 15 have never had even a single relapse. The sobriety records of those veterans range from 15 to 19 years. This demonstration is a marvelous inspiration for us all. It clinches AA's claim that almost any alcoholic who can continuously work the AA program has better than a 3-to-1 chance of staying sober for his lifetime. Now a final word. Nearly all of the last 15 years of my life have been invested in the construction of AA's General Service Headquarters. My heart is still there, and it will continue to be. To me, AA's World Services are that important. No words can express the gratitude I feel toward my associates, the people who have really done this job. Our thanks go out to all of you who have given this work of world service your unstinted attention and support. Lois and I also want to set on the record our special gratitude to nearly 300,000 purchasers of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. As you have seen, the income from the big book has made our headquarters possible. But it has done even more than this. The royalties from it have provided Lois and me with a home, where we have seen more than 3,000 of you over the years. For Lois and me the autumn of life has now rolled around. For your sake and for ours, we think that we should no longer pursue the strenuous activities of other days. We feel that we are facing a season of reflection upon all that has happened. Perhaps we can commit to writing more of the great experiences of AA's past so they may be put in permanent store for the future. We think, too, we ought to grow up a great deal more ourselves. As one-time teachers in AA's School of the Spirit, we find that thousands of our pupils have made far better personal demonstrations than we. So it is high time that we now try to catch up with you. Of course, I feel not a little sad that I can no longer be your headquarters handyman. But I do rejoice that Alcoholics Anonymous has come of age and, through its great service conference and by God's grace, can take its own destiny by the hand.